Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, a place where history slows its breathing, curiosity lowers its voice, and long ideas are allowed to stretch out comfortably in the dark. Tonight, we're settling into a thought that doesn't announce itself loudly or demand belief. It simply waits, patient and heavy, like a stone half buried in soil that no one remembers turning over. The idea is this: humanity may not be the first advanced civilization to walk this planet. We may not even be the second or the third or the fourth. We may be the seventh. And if that sounds improbable, inconvenient, or quietly unsettling, it is because the story we inherited was designed to feel complete, smooth, and safely linear. This is not a tale about aliens descending from the sky or secret cabals meeting in candlelit rooms. It is a calmer, stranger notion that civilizations can rise, master their world, and then vanish so thoroughly that what remains is mistaken for myth, geology, or coincidence. That evidence can be erased not only by force but by time, water, fire, and the comforting human preference for simple timelines. If you find this kind of slow exploration soothing, or if you enjoy letting history wander a little beyond the well-lit paths, a quiet like and subscription helps this space continue existing for others who enjoy the same pace. This channel grows gently, the way memory does, not all at once, but layer by layer. Now settle in. There is no need to hold on to every detail. Nothing here demands urgency. We begin far before dates, far before writing, and even before the idea that progress only moves forward. The version of human history most people learn is tidy. It begins with scattered hunter-gatherers, hesitant agriculture, the slow appearance of villages, then cities, writing, mathematics, and finally complex civilizations. Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica. A neat staircase ascending from ignorance to knowledge, each step explained, each tool evolving logically from the last. It is a reassuring story. It suggests inevitability. It suggests that what we are now was always where we were headed. But neat stories rarely survive close inspection. When archaeologists, geologists, and historians began looking carefully at the deep past, they started finding things that did not fit cleanly on that staircase. Not anomalies in the sense of single odd objects, but patterns of disruption. Gaps where development should have been gradual. Knowledge appearing fully formed rather than slowly assembled. Stonework that looks less like experimentation and more like mastery. Consider the uncomfortable fact that civilization, as defined by large-scale organization, advanced engineering, and astronomical knowledge, seems to appear suddenly in multiple places. Sumer does not ease into complexity. It arrives with writing, law codes, irrigation, geometry, and mythological systems already intertwined. Egypt's earliest monuments are not crude prototypes, but massive, precise constructions that later generations struggle to replicate. This inversion of expectation is rarely emphasized. It is easier to say that the earlier steps simply have not been found yet. But when absence persists for centuries of excavation, absence itself becomes data. If humanity were truly on its first climb, the archaeological record would resemble a learning curve. Instead, it often resembles a reset. Sophistication appears, collapses, and then reappears elsewhere, as if knowledge survives catastrophe not intact but fragmented, passed along as story, ritual, or symbol. This is where the idea of sequential civilizations begins to take shape, not as fantasy, but as a pattern that repeats too often to ignore. Geology adds weight to this possibility. The Earth does not preserve the past kindly. Coastlines shift, ice sheets advance and retreat, oceans rise and swallow continents. A civilization built during a warmer interglacial period would likely have established itself along rivers and coasts, precisely the regions most vulnerable to flooding and erosion. After 10 or 20,000 years, its cities would not look like ruins. They would look like hills, reefs, or oddly shaped seabeds. Tools made of stone might survive. Metals would corrode. Organic materials would vanish almost entirely. What remains would be difficult to recognize unless one already expected to find it. Modern humans tend to underestimate how complete a planetary reset can be. The Younger Dryas event, for example, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions around 12th to 800 years ago, altered climate patterns globally within decades. Massive floods, extinctions, and population bottlenecks followed. Entire regions became uninhabitable. If a civilization existed before such an event, its end would not leave behind neatly abandoned cities waiting to be excavated. It would leave confusion, survivors, stories, and a long, quiet forgetting. This brings us to the notion of erased evidence. Erasure does not require intent. Fire erases libraries, water erases cities, ice erases coastlines, time erases context. What survives without context becomes meaningless or misclassified. A worked stone becomes a curiosity. A precision-cut block becomes ceremonial. An advanced map becomes symbolic art. When later cultures encounter remnants they cannot explain, they adapt them into myth. Gods become teachers. Builders become giants. Technologies become miracles. Across cultures separated by oceans, certain themes repeat with unusual consistency. There are stories of earlier ages that ended in catastrophe. There are flood narratives describing the destruction of a previous world order. There are accounts of wise ancestors who possess knowledge the current age struggles to reclaim. These are often dismissed as metaphor, but metaphor does not explain why the same structural memory appears globally. It is easier to call these stories fiction than to consider that they may encode distorted memories of real events experienced by people who did not yet write history as we understand it. If we step away from the assumption that history must be continuous, and instead view it as episodic, a different picture emerges. Civilization becomes less like a ladder and more like a wave. It rises, peaks, collapses, and leaves traces that the next wave builds upon without fully understanding their origin. Each new civilization inherits not a blank slate, but a landscape shaped by those who came before. Some knowledge is rediscovered, some is misinterpreted, some is lost again. Under this framework, the idea of humanity being the seventh civilization is not precise in a numerical sense, but conceptual. It suggests that multiple global or semi-global civilizations may have risen before recorded history, each erased by environmental upheaval, impact events, or internal collapse. What we call prehistory may actually be post-history, the aftermath of stories already told and forgotten. This interpretation helps explain why certain ancient sites appear out of place in their supposed time, why megalithic structures display precision that later cultures could not replicate using known methods, why astronomical alignments reflect long-term cycles that require centuries of observation, why myths speak of inheritance rather than invention, why early civilizations seem obsessed with restoring balance rather than progressing toward novelty. Erasure also occurs intellectually. When a civilization collapses, survivors prioritize survival, not record-keeping. Oral traditions compress complexity. Over generations, practical instructions degrade into ritual. Engineering becomes ceremony. Science becomes religion. By the time writing returns, the original context is gone. The story that gets written is not the original one, but a reconstruction shaped by fear, reverence, and guesswork. Modern archaeology, despite its rigour, operates within assumptions formed during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Those assumptions favour linear progress and minimise the likelihood of lost global civilizations. Evidence that challenges this framework is often labelled anomalous, fringe, or coincidental. Not because it has been disproven, but because it does not fit comfortably. This is not a conspiracy. It is a cognitive bias. Paradigms resist revision until pressure becomes unavoidable. Pressure is building quietly. Underwater archaeology is revealing submerged structures that predate known coastal settlements. Ice core data continues to refine timelines of abrupt climate change. Satellite imaging uncovers geometric formations beneath jungle canopies. Each discovery on its own is explainable. Together they suggest that the story of human civilization may be longer, more fragmented and less orderly than previously assumed. If evidence of earlier civilizations has been erased, it does not mean nothing remains. It means what remains must be interpreted differently. The past may not announce itself with clear labels. It may whisper through alignments, inconsistencies, and the strange feeling that something familiar is being rediscovered rather than invented. As we move forward, the focus will not be on proving a single lost civilization beyond doubt. That is not how deep history reveals itself. Instead, the focus will be on patterns, on what repeats across time and geography, on why humanity seems to rebuild the same structures of power, belief, and technology again and again, on why we carry myths of golden ages behind us and anxieties of collapse ahead of us. This is not the beginning of a conclusion. It is the settling of the ground beneath it. The idea that we are the seventh civilization does not demand belief. It asks only for patience, for the willingness to sit with uncertainty and allow history to feel older than it admits. The traces are faint, but they are not silent. And as we continue, those traces begin to form shapes that feel less like coincidence and more like inheritance, carrying us gently into what came before the first records, before names, before the memory of starting over. Long before clay tablets hardened in the sun, and long before ink soaked into papyrus, the world was already carrying knowledge that feels oddly mature for its supposed age. This is the part of history often described as silent, empty, or primitive. It is usually framed as a blank stretch of time filled with small groups learning slowly, one hard lesson at a time. Yet when the silence is examined carefully, it does not feel empty at all. It feels crowded with signals that suggest familiarity rather than discovery, inheritance rather than invention. The conventional timeline insists that complex knowledge emerges only after writing. Before that, humans are said to have lived close to nature, reacting rather than planning, improvising rather than engineering. It is a comforting picture because it keeps sophistication safely contained within history as we record it. But comfort does not equal accuracy. When archaeologists and researchers look closely at the earliest known centres of civilization, what stands out is not hesitation or gradual progress, but confidence. Systems appear already integrated. Agriculture aligns with seasonal cycles precisely. Architecture reflects mathematical understanding. Social organisation follows rules that imply long experimentation already completed. This raises a quiet but persistent problem. Knowledge does not usually appear fully assembled. Skills develop through trial, error, failure, and refinement. Yet the earliest evidence we have of large-scale civilization shows little sign of this learning curve. Instead, it suggests that something had already been learned elsewhere, earlier and perhaps lost. Consider early agriculture. The domestication of plants is not a simple process. It requires long-term observation, selective breeding, understanding of soil, water management, and seasonal timing. Yet multiple crops appear domesticated almost simultaneously in different regions, with no clear transitional stages preserved. Wheat, barley, rice, maize, and potatoes emerge as if humanity suddenly knew what to do with them. The idea that scattered groups independently crack these complex biological systems at roughly the same time strains probability. It becomes easier to imagine that agricultural knowledge survived a collapse and re-emerged where conditions allowed. The same pattern appears in astronomy. Ancient structures align with solstices, equinoxes, and stellar movements that require long-term observation to identify. Tracking precession, for example, is not something discovered in a single generation. It unfolds over centuries. Yet early cultures encoded this knowledge in monuments, myths, and calendars. This implies continuity of observation that predates the civilizations credited with recording it. The sky had already been studied, the rhythms had already been mapped. Stonework offers another uncomfortable clue. In several ancient sites, the oldest layers show the highest precision. Massive stones cut with tight tolerances, fitted without mortar, aligned with extraordinary accuracy. Later additions often appear cruder, as if the builders were imitating something they no longer fully understood. This inversion challenges the idea of linear technological progress. It suggests that knowledge was not being invented upward, but recovered downward, fragment by fragment. When these sites are dated, the contradiction deepens. The precision work often belongs to periods when humans are said to have lacked the tools necessary to produce it. Explanations range from lost techniques to experimental methods, but none fully resolve the issue. The simplest possibility is rarely explored, that the builders inherited techniques from a prior civilization whose tools and methods did not survive in recognizable form. Memory without writing behaves differently than memory with it. Oral cultures do not preserve details the same way. They preserve meaning, pattern and instruction through repetition and symbolism. Over generations, technical knowledge becomes ritualized. Measurements turn into sacred proportions. Engineering steps become ceremonial acts. What began as practical understanding becomes mythologized survival of that understanding. This transformation explains why early myths often describe gods or ancestors teaching humans skills they already seem capable of applying. The gods are not external beings in these stories so much as personifications of lost authority. They represent a time when knowledge came from elsewhere, from before, from something no longer accessible. When people forget the origin of knowledge, they externalize it. Flood myths exemplify this process. They are not simple stories about water. They describe resets. They speak of a world before that was orderly, advanced, and then destroyed. Survivors are few. Knowledge is saved selectively. Civilization begins again, but with a sense of loss already embedded in its foundation. These stories appear across continents with remarkable consistency, not in detail, but in structure. That consistency suggests shared experience rather than coincidence. Geological evidence supports the plausibility of such resets. Sea levels at the end of the last ice age rose dramatically. Entire coastlines vanished. Human populations were displaced inland. If a civilization existed along now submerged shores, it would be effectively erased from conventional archaeology. What remains underwater is difficult to study and often dismissed as natural formation, unless unmistakably artificial. The absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence only when absence is assumed to be neutral. Early civilizations also show signs of inherited social complexity. Legal systems, trade networks, and religious hierarchies appear rapidly. These are not simple constructs. They require long-term negotiation, failure, and adaptation. Yet they emerge already functional. This suggests that social technology, like physical technology, may have been preserved imperfectly through collapse. Language itself carries hints of deep inheritance. Certain symbolic associations appear repeatedly across unrelated cultures. Serpents linked to knowledge, mountains associated with origins, stars tied to destiny. These are not arbitrary choices. They reflect shared metaphors likely rooted in shared experiences. When language evolves independently, symbolism diverges. When symbolism converges globally, it implies common ancestry or transmission. One of the strongest indicators that the world already knew too much lies in what early civilizations prioritized. They focused less on innovation and more on preservation. Myths emphasize restoring balance, maintaining cosmic order, and honoring what came before. Innovation is often framed as dangerous or hubristic. This is not the mindset of a species discovering its potential for the first time. It is the mindset of a species aware of what was lost. Calendars offer another revealing detail. Early calendars track not only agricultural cycles, but long astronomical periods. Some count tens of thousands of years. This scale of thinking is unnecessary for survival, but essential for remembrance. It implies that time itself was being measured with an awareness of deep cycles, perhaps learned through bitter experience. There is also the question of motivation. Why would early societies invest so much effort in stone monuments, alignments, and durable construction unless they feared impermanence? Wood rots, clay erodes, stone endures. A culture confident in its continuity does not prioritise permanence the way a culture aware of collapse does. Stone becomes memory made physical. What emerges from all this is not proof of a single lost civilization, but evidence of a world shaped by prior knowledge, a world where humans were not starting from ignorance but from fragments, a world rebuilding itself with incomplete instructions, filling gaps with myth, reverence and ritual. The sophistication of early civilizations begins to look less miraculous and more residual. Erasure does not only remove objects, it removes context. When context is gone, interpretation defaults to the assumptions of the interpreter. Modern frameworks assume progress moves forward. Therefore, anything advanced must belong later. Anything early must be simple. This circular logic filters evidence before it is consciously evaluated. The deeper past becomes uncomfortable because it suggests fragility. It implies that advancement is not guaranteed, that intelligence does not immunize against catastrophe, that civilizations can reach impressive heights and still fail. This challenges modern narratives of inevitability and superiority. It is easier to imagine ancestors as primitive than to imagine predecessors as peers. Before the first records, the world may not have been waiting to be taught. It may have been remembering imperfectly, slowly, and under pressure. Knowledge survives collapse not as data, but as instinct, symbol, and repetition. It hides in architecture, in stories, in alignments, in the way humans seem drawn to rebuild the same patterns again and again. As writing finally appears, it does not begin with curiosity about origins. It begins with administration, ownership, and ritual. The deeper story is already assumed. The records we have do not mark the beginning of civilization. They mark the point at which civilization felt stable enough to count things again. The world that existed before those records may not have been primitive. It may have been experienced, worn, scarred. A world that already knew what collapse looked like and tried, quietly, to make the next attempt last longer. That inherited awareness lingers beneath the surface of early history, shaping decisions, fears, and priorities in ways that only make sense if humanity had already been here before, already learned too much, and already lost it once. From that inherited knowing, civilizations begin to rise again, carrying fragments they cannot fully explain, setting the stage for patterns that repeat across time, patterns that become clearer as attention shifts from what history claims to show to what it seems reluctant to remember. When history is presented as a settled account, it usually arrives in the form of a list. Names, dates, places, a sequence that feels authoritative simply because it is familiar. In that list, we are told that civilization began a handful of times, in a handful of places almost miraculously. Sumer in Mesopotamia, Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley, early China along the Yellow River, Mesoamerica with the Olmec and Maya, the Andes with Norte Chico and later cultures. Different teachers may group or rename them, but the number stays roughly the same. These are the cradles of civilization. These are the origins. Everything else is said to flow outward from them. On the surface, this looks like diversity. Different climates, different peoples, different belief systems. But when examined without the comforting filter of inevitability, a strange uniformity begins to appear. These civilizations do not behave like independent experiments. They behave like echoes, Each of them appears rapidly rather than gradually. Each emerges with agriculture, social hierarchy, monumental architecture, astronomy, and symbolic systems already intertwined. Each places disproportionate emphasis on the sky, on cycles, on timekeeping far beyond immediate survival needs. Each carries myths of earlier ages, lost wisdom, and catastrophic resets. Each begins with a confidence that feels inherited rather than discovered. Take Sumer, often called the first civilization. Writing appears there not as a crude system of scratches slowly becoming symbolic, but as a complex administrative tool capable of accounting, law, and myth almost immediately. The earliest texts already reference kingship descending from elsewhere, from a time before the flood. The Sumerian king list famously extends reigns into impossibly long spans, not because the scribes were ignorant, but because they were preserving a memory framework that did not fit later reality. When the flood comes in their narratives, it does not mark the birth of civilization, but its interruption. Egypt follows a similar trajectory. The earliest dynasties do not begin with tentative mud brick huts and uncertain engineering. They begin with stone, geometry, alignment, and a cosmology already mature. The Great Pyramid does not sit at the end of a long experimental arc. It stands near the beginning. Later pyramids are smaller, less precise, and more symbolic. Egyptian records themselves speak of a time before dynastic rule, an age of gods or semi-divine beings who ruled when the world was different. These accounts are often dismissed as theology, but they mirror the same structural memory found elsewhere. The Indus Valley civilization appears with planned cities, standardized bricks, advanced drainage systems, and a symbolic script that remains undeciphered. There is little evidence of gradual urban chaos or haphazard growth. Streets are laid out logically, infrastructure suggests long familiarity with urban problems. Then, without clear evidence of invasion or decline, the civilization disperses. Knowledge fragments. The script disappears. What follows is not progression, but decentralization. In China, early dynastic history blends seamlessly into myth. The Xia dynasty hovers between legend and archaeology. Flood control myths describe engineering feats attributed to culture heroes rather than inventors. Writing appears fully symbolic. Bronze metallurgy emerges sophisticated. Again, the early phase shows no awkward adolescence. Mesoamerica presents perhaps the clearest example of inherited patterning. The Olmec appear suddenly with colossal stone heads, ceremonial centres, calendar systems, and iconography that later cultures adopt almost wholesale. The Maya refine astronomy to astonishing precision, tracking cycles far longer than a human lifetime. Their inscriptions speak not only of kings and wars, but of deep time, world ages, and previous creations destroyed and renewed. Collapse follows, and once again, knowledge survives unevenly. In the Andes, Norte Chico develops monumental architecture without pottery, without apparent warfare, and with social organization already complex. Later Andean cultures inherit stone techniques and cosmological alignments they treat as ancient even in their own time. Inca myths describe earlier peoples turned to stone, a memory encoded literally into the landscape. These civilizations are taught as separate origins, but their similarities are too consistent to ignore. Each arises near water. Each builds monuments aligned to celestial cycles. Each encodes time as cyclical rather than linear. Each preserves myths of prior worlds. Each collapses or transforms abruptly. Each leaves behind successors who revere the past more than they understand it. If these were independent inventions, variation would dominate. Some would focus on different priorities. Some would ignore the sky. Some would avoid monumentality. Some would lack flood myths or reset narratives. Instead, the same themes repeat with quiet insistence. This repetition suggests not coincidence, but inheritance. What is being inherited is not technology in a modern sense, but frameworks, ways of organizing reality, ways of relating humans to time, land, and cosmos. These frameworks behave like cultural DNA, surviving catastrophe by embedding themselves in ritual, architecture, and story rather than instruction manuals. The pattern becomes clearer when looking at what these civilizations share, not just at their height, but at their beginnings. They all behave as if they are restoring something. Founding myths often describe re-establishing order after chaos. Kings are portrayed as stewards, not innovators. Laws are framed as rediscovered rather than invented. Sacred proportions are described as ancient even when newly applied. This restoration mindset is incompatible with a species inventing civilization for the first time. First-time inventors experiment freely. They test boundaries. They celebrate novelty. These civilizations instead emphasize continuity, balance, and cosmic alignment. They behave like inheritors managing a fragile legacy. Another shared feature is the reverence for stone. Stone is chosen not because it is easy, but because it lasts. Stone monuments require immense labour and planning, often far beyond immediate necessity. They serve as anchors in time. When civilizations know collapse is possible, permanence becomes sacred. The 6 civilizations are also united by selective amnesia. Each remembers fragments of the deep past but lacks full clarity. This produces gods who teach skills without explanation, heroes who rebuild rather than discover, and ancestors whose accomplishments are exaggerated because their methods are lost. Myth fills the gaps left by erasure. Modern historical frameworks isolate these civilizations geographically and chronologically, but catastrophes do not respect boundaries. Climate shifts are global, sea level rise is global, impact events are global. If an earlier civilization existed, even partially global in reach, its collapse would scatter survivors unevenly. Knowledge would resurface where conditions allowed, shaped by local geography but guided by shared memory. The number 6 itself is arbitrary. It reflects what survives above the threshold of recognition. It reflects what left stone, cities and texts in regions later studied extensively. It does not reflect how many attempts may have occurred before, nor how many failed too completely to leave recognizable traces. What matters is not the count, but the behavior. The 6 civilizations we're told about all act like successors rather than originators. They share a posture toward the past that feels cautious, reverent, and burdened. They do not ask who came before as if it were a mystery. They speak as if they already know the answer, even if they can no longer explain it. This pattern suggests a deeper continuity beneath the surface of history. It suggests that civilization does not begin once and march forward triumphantly. It suggests that civilization happens repeatedly, interrupted by forces larger than human planning, and that each iteration inherits fragments of the last. Under this lens, the idea that we are the 7th civilization stops sounding dramatic and starts sounding procedural. We are not special because we are advanced. We are familiar because we are repeating a cycle. The same attention to energy, the same manipulation of materials, the same faith in progress, the same blindness to fragility. The 6 civilizations are not isolated miracles. They are signposts along a longer road. Each marks a moment when humanity stood up again, brushed off the dust, and tried once more to make permanence out of an impermanent world. They share patterns because they share ancestry, not genetic ancestry, but experiential ancestry. As their stories fade into textbooks, the pattern remains embedded in stone, myth, and alignment. And when that pattern is followed forward instead of backward, it leads uncomfortably toward the present, toward a civilization that believes itself unprecedented while unconsciously repeating the same assumptions, the same vulnerabilities, and the same confidence that this time it will be different. That confidence too has appeared before. Between the 6 civilizations that appear in textbooks and the long stretches of prehistory they supposedly rise from, there is a silence that feels too clean. It is not the kind of silence that comes from ignorance or lack of exploration. It is a silence shaped like something that should be there. A missing layer in the timeline, smoothed over until it looks natural, but never quite convincing once you notice its edges. History, as it is usually presented, moves from scattered hunter-gatherers to settled agriculture, then slowly toward complexity. The gap between these stages is expected to be messy, full of half-built ideas, failed experiments, and uneven progress. Instead, what we often find is a sharp transition. Before, simplicity. After, complexity. In between, very little. This absence is usually explained away as preservation bias. Organic materials decay, early structures were temporary, evidence simply did not survive. These explanations are reasonable in isolation. Together, repeated across continents and millennia, they begin to feel insufficient. The missing layer is not a single century or even a single millennium. It spans thousands of years where humanity is assumed to have been learning very slowly, yet somehow emerges on the other side already fluent. The tools, techniques, and social systems that appear require long development, but the record rarely shows that development in progress. It shows results. Take architecture as a starting point. Large-scale stone construction demands quarrying, transportation, shaping, alignment, and coordination of labour. These are not skills that appear overnight. Yet in multiple regions, the earliest monumental stone structures display high precision. There is little evidence of earlier, cruder attempts using the same materials at the same scale. One would expect to find collapsed experiments, misaligned foundations, abandoned prototypes. Instead, the first examples are often the most accomplished. The same pattern appears in symbolic systems. Writing does not usually evolve from nothing to abstraction instantly. It typically passes through pictographs, simplification, standardization, and then symbolic compression. While this process is assumed to have occurred, the physical evidence is sparse. Writing systems appear already capable of handling administration, myth, and record-keeping. The scaffolding stages are mostly theoretical reconstructions rather than documented realities. This missing layer becomes even more pronounced when considering timekeeping and astronomy. Accurate calendars require generations of observation. Knowledge of long celestial cycles requires centuries, yet early civilizations encode this information as if it were already known. The time required to discover it is rarely reflected in the archaeological layers attributed to those cultures. Geology complicates the picture further. The end of the last ice age was not a gentle transition. It was punctuated by abrupt climate shifts, massive floods, and ecological upheaval. These events would not merely inconvenience early humans. They would erase settlements, displace populations, and destroy continuity. If a civilization existed before or during these transitions, its material culture would likely be fragmented beyond easy recognition. What remains would be scattered, submerged, or reworked by later peoples who had no awareness of its original context. Sea level rise alone accounts for the loss of vast habitable regions. Coastlines during the last glacial maximum were dramatically different. Some estimates suggest that a significant portion of early human population lived in areas now underwater. If complex societies developed there, their primary centres would be inaccessible or invisible to traditional archaeology. The missing layer may not be missing at all. It may be drowned. There is also a methodological gap. Archaeology excels at identifying gradual change within stable contexts. It struggles with collapse. When a culture disappears abruptly, continuity breaks. Tools may be reused, stones may be repurposed, ruins may be built over. Later layers overwrite earlier ones, blending timelines until distinction becomes difficult. What looks like a sudden beginning may actually be a reoccupation. The unnatural gap is reinforced by classification habits. Artifacts that do not fit expected timelines are often redated, reclassified, or set aside as anomalies. This is not done maliciously. It is done to maintain coherence. A timeline that includes an unexplained advanced layer beneath known civilizations creates discomfort. It raises questions that ripple outward, challenging established narratives far beyond archaeology. Cultural memory hints at this gap repeatedly. Myths do not describe slow awakening. They describe loss. A previous age ends. Knowledge is scattered. Survivors rebuild with partial understanding. These stories are often treated as allegory, but allegory usually simplifies. These myths complicate. They preserve sequence, not metaphor. Before, after, destruction, restoration. The missing layer sits exactly where the myths place it. The unnatural gap also appears in technological discontinuities. Certain techniques appear, vanish, and then reappear centuries later. Stone-cutting methods that produce tight tolerances are present in early megalithic sites, absent in later periods, and then reinvented using different tools. This stop-and-start pattern makes little sense in a linear model. It makes more sense if knowledge was lost and later rediscovered independently. Human population genetics add another subtle clue. Bottlenecks appear repeatedly in the genetic record. These suggest periods when human populations dropped sharply and then recovered. Such events align with climate catastrophes and impact hypotheses. A population bottleneck is not just a reduction in numbers, it is a reduction in cultural carriers. When elders, specialists and skilled practitioners are lost disproportionately, knowledge collapses faster than genes. The missing layer may represent one or more periods when humanity nearly reset. Not to zero, but close enough that continuity broke. Afterward, survivors rebuilt using what they remembered, what they adapted, and what they misunderstood. Over generations, the origin of that knowledge blurred. By the time writing returned, the deeper past was already mythologized. There is also the issue of scale. Modern humans assume that advanced civilization must look like modern cities. But an earlier civilization may have optimized differently. It may have used materials that do not preserve well. It may have avoided heavy metal use. It may have focused on astronomical, agricultural or hydraulic mastery, rather than industrial output. Its footprint would be lighter, easier to erase. The timeline gap is further reinforced by a psychological need for simplicity. A story with a clear beginning is comforting. A story with multiple beginnings, collapses, and false starts is unsettling. It implies vulnerability. It implies that progress is reversible. It implies that what we are building now is not guaranteed to endure. These implications are rarely stated outright, but they influence which interpretations feel acceptable. Educational systems reinforce this preference. History is taught as a march, not a loop. Each era builds upon the last. Catastrophe is treated as interruption, not reset. The idea that civilization itself might have been interrupted multiple times challenges the core structure of historical teaching. Yet when the data is laid out without narrative smoothing, the gap remains visible. Too much knowledge appears too early. Too many patterns repeat across supposedly independent origins. Too many myths align with geological possibility. Too much absence sits where development should be visible. The missing layer does not announce itself with clear borders. It is not labelled. It does not present a single artifact that settles the matter. It reveals itself through discomfort. Through the feeling that explanations require too many qualifiers. Through the repeated use of phrases like somehow, suddenly and unexpectedly. This gap may not represent a single lost civilization. It may represent several attempts, each partially erased. Layers of rise and collapse compressed into a blur that modern timelines flatten into prehistory. What survives is not a clean record, but a palimpsest. A surface written over again and again, with faint traces of earlier text still visible beneath. As attention moves deeper into this gap, the focus shifts from asking why there is no evidence to asking what kind of evidence would survive. Stone, alignment, myth, repetition. Not machines, not manuals, not archives. The missing layer may never be filled in neatly. It may only be inferred through absence and pattern, and once that absence is acknowledged, the 6 civilizations begin to look less like beginnings and more like markers. Points where humanity reassembled enough stability to leave durable traces again. Between them lies a stretch of time that was not empty, only erased unevenly. That erased stretch presses quietly against the present. Because if the timeline contains a missing layer once, it can contain one again. And if civilizations before us believed they were building something unprecedented only to vanish into that gap, then the gap itself becomes part of the pattern, waiting patiently for the next layer to be laid on top of it. Across the ancient world, stone stands where it should not, shaped in ways that feel out of place in the timelines assigned to it, not because stone is unusual, but because of how it has been treated. Stone does not forgive mistakes easily. It resists improvisation. It demands planning, precision, and experience. When stonework appears that shows mastery rather than experimentation, it quietly undermines the idea that the builders were learning as they went. In several of the oldest monumental sites on Earth, the earlier stonework is also the most refined. Blocks weighing tens or even hundreds of tons are cut with flatness and angles that rival modern machining. Joints are tight enough that blades cannot be inserted between stones. Surfaces meet with intentional geometry, not approximate fitting. These are not the hallmarks of a culture tentatively discovering construction. They are the signatures of a tradition already mature. The common explanation offered is ingenuity with simple tools. Copper chisels, stone hammers, wooden sledges, ropes, patience. And while these methods can account for some achievements, they struggle to explain consistency at scale. Experimental archaeology has shown that shaping a single block to high precision using primitive tools is possible, given enough time and skill. Doing it thousands of times across an entire complex with uniformity and alignment is a different problem entirely. That level of consistency implies standardization. Standardization implies prior knowledge. At sites like Giza, the lowest and oldest layers of stonework show the highest precision. The casing stones of the Great Pyramid were cut and placed with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimetre. The core blocks beneath are massive, arranged in patterns that distribute weight efficiently. Later pyramids, built by the same culture within a few centuries, are visibly inferior. Stones are smaller, joints are looser, alignment drifts. If technology were progressing forward, this regression would not occur. The same pattern appears in South America. At sites like Pumapunku and Sacsayhuaman, stone blocks display complex interlocking shapes, precise angles, and standardized forms that fit together in 3 dimensions. Many of these blocks appear mass-produced, as if shaped according to templates. Yet no transitional forms are found showing how this method developed. Later, Inca construction, impressive in its own right, does not replicate this level of complexity. Instead, it builds atop it. Stone walls in ancient Peru often show 2 distinct phases. The lower layers consist of massive, finely fitted stones. The upper layers use smaller, less refined blocks. This is not stylistic choice. It reflects loss of capability. The builders above were inheriting foundations they could not reproduce. They respected them, reused them, and adapted to them, but they did not improve upon them. In Egypt, temples and enclosures attributed to early dynastic periods incorporate granite blocks quarried from hundreds of kilometers away. Granite is not an easy material. It is harder than copper. Shaping it precisely requires abrasion techniques and sustained effort. Yet ancient granite surfaces are often polished flat to a degree that remains difficult to replicate efficiently, even with modern tools. Drill holes show spiral striations that imply rotational cutting under controlled pressure. These marks are often explained away as slow hand drilling, but their uniformity raises questions. Stone does not preserve mistakes well. Failed experiments leave rubble, cracked blocks, abandoned quarries filled with partially worked stone. These do exist, but not in the quantities one would expect if the learning curve were as steep as assumed. Instead, quarries often show abrupt abandonment, as if work ceased suddenly rather than gradually evolving. This fits better with interruption than development. Transportation presents another unresolved issue. Moving massive stones requires infrastructure: roads, ramps, sledges, lubrication, coordination. These systems leave traces, yet evidence for large-scale transport infrastructure is often sparse or entirely absent. The stones arrived. How they arrived is reconstructed hypothetically rather than demonstrated conclusively. Alignment adds another layer of difficulty. Many ancient stone structures are oriented with remarkable accuracy to cardinal directions or astronomical events. Achieving such alignment requires reliable reference systems, long-term observation, and mathematical understanding. Errors compound over distance. Precision at scale is not accidental. It reflects planning that begins before construction starts. Stone engineering also encodes knowledge of stress, load distribution, and seismic resilience. In earthquake-prone regions, ancient stone walls are often built with slight inward lean, interlocking shapes, and flexible joints that absorb movement. These features are sometimes rediscovered by modern engineers rather than inherited continuously. This again suggests loss and rediscovery rather than linear improvement. The choice of stone itself is telling. Stone is chosen when permanence matters. It is inefficient for temporary solutions. It is labour-intensive. It consumes enormous human effort. Cultures confident in uninterrupted continuity do not prioritise stone at the expense of flexibility. Cultures aware of collapse do. Stone becomes memory hardened against forgetting. One explanation sometimes offered is that ancient cultures had more time, that without modern distractions they could devote generations to single projects. But time alone does not produce precision. Skill transmission does. Teaching complex techniques across generations requires stable social structures, apprenticeship systems, and accumulated experience. These are markers of civilization already established, not emerging. The idea that stone engineering beyond its alleged age represents isolated genius does not hold up under repetition. One genius might exist, multiple cultures across continents independently achieving the same unlikely feats, strains plausibility. A shared inheritance fits the data more comfortably. That inheritance need not be global in reach. It could have been regional, fragmented, passed along through survivors and adapted to local conditions. What matters is that knowledge existed before the structures credited with inventing it. Stone preserves the result, not the process. When the process is lost, the result looks miraculous. Modern dating techniques further complicate the picture. Stone itself cannot be dated directly. Dating relies on surrounding organic material, construction layers, or associated artifacts. If a later culture reused an earlier stone foundation, the date assigned often reflects the reuse, not the original construction. This can compress timelines and obscure deeper origins. There is also the issue of intent. Some stonework appears over-engineered for its stated purpose. Platforms built to support nothing, enclosures larger than required, foundations deeper than necessary. These features suggest either symbolic meaning now lost or functions no longer recognized. When purpose is unclear, dismissal is easier than reinterpretation. Stone does not tell stories. It does not explain itself. It simply endures. When historians confront stone that contradicts expectations, they often focus on what can be explained rather than what resists explanation. The result is a narrative that minimizes discomfort. But discomfort accumulates. Each site alone is manageable. Together they form a pattern in which stone appears as a residue of advanced understanding that predates recorded history. a pattern in which later cultures inherit stone landscapes already shaped, already aligned, already solved. If stone engineering beyond its alleged age represents a missing technological lineage, then that lineage did not vanish completely. It fractured. Some techniques survived as ritual, some as imitation, some as myth. Others disappeared entirely. The persistence of certain construction principles across millennia hints at this fragmentation. Sacred geometry reappears, proportional systems repeat, orientation to celestial cycles persists. These are not superficial traits. They reflect underlying frameworks for understanding space, weight, and time. Stone also resists reinterpretation. Unlike texts, it cannot be retranslated to suit new paradigms. It sits stubbornly where it was placed, forcing explanation rather than accepting reinterpretation. This is why it is often described in isolation, site by site, rather than as part of a continuous technological story. The deeper implication is not that ancient people were incapable or underestimated. It is that the timeline assigned to their capabilities may be incomplete. The stone may belong to a chapter torn out of the book rather than misattributed within it. If a prior civilization existed, its most durable legacy would not be tools or texts. It would be stone. Not decorative stone, but functional, aligned, load-bearing stone meant to survive time itself. That is exactly what we find. These stones do not announce their origin. They do not carry inscriptions explaining their methods. They simply remain, waiting to be measured, remeasured, and reconsidered. Each generation approaches them with new assumptions. Each finds them slightly ahead of expectation. Stone that should not exist according to the timeline continues to exist regardless of explanation. It does not argue. It does not persuade. It persists. And persistence, over thousands of years, becomes its own form of evidence. As attention moves forward, away from individual blocks and toward the systems that place them, the question shifts from how ancient people could have built such things to when the knowledge that allowed it first appeared. That question does not settle comfortably within accepted chronology. It pushes outward, toward deeper time, toward the missing layer, toward the possibility that the stone beneath our feet remembers a world older than the stories we tell about it. There is a particular kind of unease that arises when knowledge appears without an obvious origin. Not inspiration, not intuition, but structured, technical understanding that seems to arrive already complete. Maps that depict places never seen from the ground, alignments that require centuries of observation, measurements that assume a familiarity with the Earth as a sphere rather than a surface. These are not curiosities at the edges of history. They sit uncomfortably at its foundations. Maps are a good place to begin because maps are never neutral. A map does not simply show where things are. It reflects what the map maker believes the world is. To draw a map accurately, one must know scale, distance, proportion, and orientation. One must understand how land curves, how directions relate, how far one point lies from another. This kind of understanding usually develops slowly through exploration, correction, and accumulation of error. Yet some ancient maps appear with surprisingly little error at all. The most famous examples are often dismissed quickly, precisely because they are uncomfortable. Medieval-era maps based on much older sources depict coastlines that were supposedly unknown at the time. Some show Antarctica not as an icebound mass, but as a land with defined coasts, rivers, and mountain ranges. Others represent the Americas with proportions that suggest surveying rather than speculation. These maps are usually explained as coincidence, guesswork, or later alteration. But coincidence becomes less convincing when accuracy clusters. What is often overlooked is that these maps are not isolated inventions. They are copies. Their creators frequently state that they are working from older sources, compiled, translated, or inherited. This admission is treated as literary flourish rather than factual claim. But mapmakers, especially those whose reputations depended on accuracy, did not casually invent sources they knew could be questioned. They were preserving something they believed already existed. The deeper issue is not whether every detail on these maps is correct. No map is perfect. The issue is that the underlying framework assumes a global perspective, a sense of Earth as a measurable whole, rather than a collection of local regions. That perspective requires either extensive global travel or a method of observation beyond ground-level exploration. Neither fits comfortably into accepted timelines. Alignments tell a similar story, but in stone rather than ink. Across the world, ancient structures are oriented with precision towards celestial events: solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, stellar risings. These alignments are not decorative. They are accurate to degrees, sometimes fractions of degrees. They persist across continents, built by cultures that supposedly had no contact with one another. Aligning a structure to the solstice requires knowing when the solstice occurs. Not once, but reliably. That requires repeated observation over many years. Aligning to more complex cycles, such as the precession of the equinoxes, requires observation over many generations. Precession unfolds over roughly 26,000 years. To notice it at all requires patience and record-keeping far beyond immediate survival needs. Yet ancient myths, calendars, and monuments encode this knowledge. Ages of the world align with precessional cycles. Mythic ages end and begin in ways that mirror astronomical transitions. This is often labelled symbolic. But symbolism does not require accuracy. These systems exhibit both. The consistency of alignments is particularly revealing. If early civilizations were independently discovering astronomy, variation would dominate. Some would align structures loosely, some would miscalculate, some would ignore the sky altogether. Instead, similar principles repeat. Cardinal orientation, solar and lunar emphasis, long cycles treated as meaningful. This suggests inheritance of a framework rather than spontaneous invention. There is also the matter of precision without obvious instrumentation. Aligning massive stone structures accurately requires reference tools, sighting devices, stable baselines, methods for transferring angles across distances. These tools are rarely found. Either they were made of perishable materials, or they were never recovered, or the builders used methods not yet understood. All three explanations point toward missing context. The same absence appears in measurement systems. Ancient units of length often relate closely to the dimensions of the Earth. Certain measures correspond to fractions of planetary circumference with surprising accuracy. This relationship is sometimes dismissed as numerological coincidence, but coincidence does not repeat so consistently across cultures using different symbols but similar ratios. To measure the Earth accurately requires surveying over large distances, understanding curvature, and applying mathematics capable of handling scale. These are not trivial accomplishments. They require organisation, continuity, and time, yet they appear embedded in systems that are supposed to be local and early. Knowledge without a source creates tension in historical models. To resolve that tension, explanations often focus on what ancient people could not have known, rather than on what the evidence suggests they did know. This inversion protects the timeline but leaves questions unanswered. One common response is to attribute advanced knowledge to later reinterpretation, that later scholars read too much into ancient designs, that alignments are exaggerated, that maps were corrected retroactively. In some cases this is true, but it does not account for the cumulative weight of examples where reinterpretation fails to explain precision. Another response is to fragment the evidence. Maps are discussed separately from monuments. Astronomy is separated from mythology. Measurement systems are isolated from geography. When viewed independently, each anomaly seems manageable. When viewed together, they form a coherent pattern. A pattern of advanced spatial understanding present earlier than expected. This pattern does not require a technologically modern civilization in the contemporary sense. It does not imply satellites or digital computation. It implies a civilization that prioritized observation, continuity, and integration of knowledge. A civilization that understood cycles rather than speed. One that measured the world carefully because it expected to live within those measurements for a long time. If such a civilization existed, its knowledge would be vulnerable to collapse. Observation-based sciences depend on uninterrupted continuity. Break the chain, and rediscovery takes generations. Survivors may remember alignments without remembering why. They may preserve maps without understanding their projection. They may ritualize knowledge that was once practical. This process explains why later cultures often treat inherited knowledge as sacred rather than technical. The sky becomes divine. Measurements become holy proportions. Maps become symbolic cosmologies. When function is lost, reverence takes its place. The absence of a clear source does not mean the knowledge came from nowhere. It means the source has been erased or submerged. Floods destroy libraries more efficiently than armies. Ice erases coastlines without leaving ruins. Time smooths precision into mystery. There is also a subtle psychological barrier at work. Accepting that ancient knowledge exceeded expected limits implies that modern understanding is not unique. It implies that intelligence and organization can peak and disappear. This undermines narratives of inevitable progress. It suggests that forgetting is as powerful as discovery. Maps that should not exist and alignments that should not be precise force reconsideration, not because they prove a specific lost civilization, but because they expose weaknesses in the timeline itself. They suggest that knowledge can survive without context, floating forward until it is anchored again by a new society. The most telling aspect is not the existence of this knowledge, but how it is treated by those who inherit it. Rarely is it expanded immediately. Instead, it is preserved, imitated, and protected. This behavior is consistent across cultures. It reflects caution rather than curiosity, the caution of inheritors, not pioneers. As civilizations rise again after collapse, they build around what they find. They align new structures with old ones. They copy proportions without fully understanding them. They preserve maps as relics. Over time, the original purpose fades, but the form remains. The result is a historical record filled with effects but missing causes. Precision without process, knowledge without origin, systems without documentation. These gaps are not random. They cluster in deep time, precisely where catastrophic erasure is most likely. When viewed this way, maps and alignments are not anomalies. They are survivors. Fragments of a worldview that once treated Earth as measurable, cyclical, and interconnected. A worldview that did not need to announce itself because it assumed continuity. As attention moves forward, the question becomes less about whether ancient people were capable of such knowledge, and more about how many times such knowledge has been lost. Each loss leaves behind residues that confuse later observers. Each recovery builds upon fragments rather than foundations. Knowledge without a source does not vanish quietly. It echoes, in stone, in stories, in symbols drawn again and again by cultures who feel its weight but cannot trace its origin. And those echoes grow louder the longer they are ignored, pressing gently against the idea that what we know of the past may be less a beginning than a restart, built atop measurements and memories whose true source lies deeper than the timelines allow. When a civilization collapses, it does not disappear all at once, it fades unevenly. Some things vanish instantly, others linger long enough to be mistaken for permanence. What follows is not a clean break, but a gradual loss of coherence, a process best described not as destruction, but as forgetting. This forgetting does not happen at the level of individuals, it happens at the level of systems, and when systems fail, memory fractures. Global amnesia is not the loss of all knowledge, it is the loss of context. Tools may survive, but not the reasoning behind them. Structures may endure, but not the methods that created them. Stories persist, but stripped of their original meaning. What remains is a civilization-shaped echo, carried forward by people who no longer understand its source. Collapse rarely looks dramatic from within. It is not always fire and invasion. More often, it is slow destabilization. Climate shifts alter food production. Trade networks break down. Specialists disappear. Skills that require constant practice fade first. Writing stops being maintained. Measurements lose precision. Over a few generations, complexity becomes liability rather than strength. When this happens, survival narrows priorities. Immediate needs override long-term planning. Knowledge that does not directly contribute to food, shelter, or safety is deprioritized. Astronomy becomes irrelevant unless it predicts seasons. Engineering is simplified to what can be maintained locally. Records decay without replacement. Libraries become fuel or shelter. Memory contracts. This contraction is not evenly distributed. Certain individuals survive longer. Certain traditions persist. But without institutional support, knowledge becomes fragile. It relies on oral transmission, which preserves pattern better than detail. Instructions become stories. Procedures become rituals. Over time, meaning shifts. This is how global amnesia begins, not with ignorance, but with compression. A complex system is reduced to symbols that can be carried forward without infrastructure. These symbols then form the foundation of the next civilization, even though their original function is gone. One of the first casualties of collapse is specialization. Advanced societies depend on division of labor. Engineers engineer, astronomers observe, builders build. When population drops or coordination fails, specialization becomes impossible. Generalists replace experts. Knowledge fragments. No one holds the whole picture anymore. Another casualty is scale. Large projects require coordination across time and space. After collapse, communities shrink. Horizons contract. What once required continental planning is no longer conceivable. The idea that stone could be moved across vast distances becomes implausible, not because it never happened, but because the means no longer exist. Language itself begins to shift. Technical terms lose precision. Words that once described processes come to describe outcomes. Over generations, language forgets what it once knew. When writing returns, it reflects this new linguistic reality, not the old one. Mythology plays a crucial role in this process. Myths are often treated as fictional, but they are better understood as compressed memory. They preserve relationships, sequences, and values rather than data. In the aftermath of collapse, myths become the primary vehicle for transmitting what cannot be rebuilt. Flood stories, fire stories, stories of falling skies and angry gods appear globally, not because cultures invented them independently, but because catastrophe leaves psychological scars. These stories encode warning, loss, and humility. They remind survivors that the world can change suddenly and completely. What myths rarely preserve is method. They preserve outcome. A great city existed. It was destroyed. Knowledge was lost. Survivors rebuilt. The how is gone. The why is simplified. The event becomes moralized, not analyzed. Architecture reflects this amnesia clearly. Later cultures build atop earlier foundations without understanding them. They reuse stone because it is already there. They align structures because alignment feels important, not because they can still calculate it accurately. Precision becomes imitation. This is why inherited monuments are often treated as sacred. Sacredness protects what cannot be recreated. When function is lost, reverence replaces understanding. A structure becomes untouchable not because it is fully understood, but because it is feared to be beyond comprehension. Global amnesia also reshapes social memory. Time becomes cyclical rather than linear. Instead of a long narrative of progress, cultures remember ages, before and after, golden age and fallen age. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is how societies process loss too large to fully explain. Calendars often reset after collapse. Timekeeping begins again from a new reference point. What came before becomes mythic time, inaccessible and undefined. This creates the illusion that history begins later than it actually does. Archaeologically, this amnesia manifests as gaps. Layers of habitation disappear. Occupation resumes with different materials, different techniques, different priorities. The deeper layer is often assumed to be primitive. In reality, it may simply be older and better erased. Environmental forces accelerate this forgetting. Floods redistribute debris. Earthquakes topple structures. Vegetation overtakes cities. Sediment buries what remains. Over centuries, the landscape heals in ways that conceal human presence. What was once obvious becomes invisible. Underwater, this process is even more complete. Rising seas erase coastlines without leaving ruins on dry land. Entire cultures can vanish beneath water, preserved only as anomalies on the sea floor, indistinguishable from natural formations unless specifically sought. Global amnesia is also reinforced by recovery bias. Later civilizations assume that what they find represents beginnings. They do not imagine predecessors as peers, they imagine them as ancestors, less capable, less informed. This assumption shapes interpretation. When early texts reference ancient wisdom or gods who taught humans skills, these references are often read metaphorically. But metaphor does not explain why knowledge appears suddenly and then degrades. Amnesia does. The process repeats because it is systemic. Civilization depends on stability. Stability depends on environment. When environment shifts rapidly, civilization collapses faster than adaptation can compensate. Memory breaks before genetics. Knowledge dies before language. The survivors are not ignorant. They are overwhelmed. They inherit ruins without manuals. They inherit symbols without explanations. Over time, those symbols become tradition. Tradition becomes identity. Identity becomes history. This is why global amnesia does not feel like forgetting from within. It feels like continuity. Each generation believes it knows where it came from. The gaps are normalized. The missing layers are not felt as absence because no one remembers them. Modern civilization is not immune to this process. It simply has more redundancy. But redundancy does not equal permanence. Digital records degrade faster than stone. Complex systems fail abruptly. Knowledge concentration increases fragility. The idea that a collapse could erase global knowledge feels implausible only because collapse is imagined as total. In reality, it is selective. It removes what requires coordination first. It preserves what can be carried individually. This selective survival shapes the archaeological record. What remains are the hardest materials and the simplest ideas, stone and story. Everything in between is filtered out. Global amnesia does not require malicious erasure. It requires time, disruption, and the human instinct to move forward rather than backward. Survivors rarely prioritize documenting what was lost. They focus on what can be rebuilt. The result is a historical landscape where advanced achievements appear without visible roots, where early civilizations seem implausibly competent, and where myths echo realities no longer accessible. This amnesia explains why civilizations repeatedly rediscover the same ideas. Agriculture, astronomy, geometry, social hierarchy. These are not inventions from nothing. They are reconstructions from fragments. Each time something is missing. Each time something is misunderstood. When viewed this way, the past stops looking like a steady ascent and starts looking like a series of recoveries. Each recovery imperfect, each shaped by what survived the last forgetting. Global amnesia is not a failure of humanity. It is a consequence of living on a planet that changes faster than memory can endure. Civilizations forget because they must in order to continue. They simplify in order to survive. But the forgetting is never complete. traces remain, in stone that resists erosion, in alignments that still point to the sky, in stories that refuse to disappear, in patterns that repeat even when their origin is unknown. As the story continues, attention shifts from what was forgotten to how forgetting itself shapes power, history, and authority. Because when memory breaks, those who come later inherit not just ruins, but the ability to decide what those ruins mean. And that decision quietly determines which past is remembered, which is mythologized, and which is allowed to vanish into silence. History is often described as a record of what happened. In practice, it is a record of what survived, and more specifically, of who survived with the power to tell the story. This distinction matters more than it first appears, because when civilizations collapse, they do not leave behind neutral accounts waiting to be read. They leave behind fragments, and fragments are always arranged by someone. The phrase "winners write history" is usually understood in the context of wars and empires. The victorious side controls archives, monuments, education, and memory. But on a longer timescale, the winners are not always conquerors. Sometimes they are simply the ones who endured. Survivors inherit the past in pieces, and in the absence of full context, they are forced to assemble those pieces into a narrative that makes sense for their present. Rewriting does not begin as deception. It begins as necessity. Survivors must explain the world they inhabit. They must justify social structures, ownership of land, authority, and tradition. When ruins predate them, those ruins demand interpretation. When tools appear whose makers are unknown, meaning must be assigned. Over time, these interpretations harden into accepted truth. This is how history quietly shifts, not through lies, but through replacement. One story takes the place of another because it is usable. The deeper story becomes inconvenient, incomplete, or destabilizing. The rewritten version becomes reality. After collapse, survivors rarely see themselves as inheritors of something advanced. They see themselves as beginnings. This is not arrogance, it is psychological survival. To believe one is merely a diminished remnant of something greater invites despair. To believe one is at the start of a new ascent invites purpose. The past is reframed accordingly. Ancient texts reflect this tension clearly. Many early civilizations describe themselves as restorers of order after chaos. They inherit a broken world and re-establish balance. Over time, the chaos recedes into myth, and the restoration becomes creation. What was once repair is retold as invention. This shift is subtle. It happens over generations. The first survivors remember loss. Their children remember stories. Their grandchildren remember tradition. Eventually the memory of loss fades, leaving only the structure built on top of it. That structure becomes history. Winners write history when they dominate. Survivors rewrite it when they rebuild. This rewriting is visible in origin myths. Civilizations often describe themselves as emerging from caves, mud, or divine intervention. These stories are symbolic, but they also serve a function. They establish legitimacy. They define who belongs and who does not. They explain why the current order exists. When earlier civilizations are acknowledged at all, they are framed as primitive, chaotic, or morally flawed. Their destruction is justified as necessary. Floods become punishment. Fires become cleansing. Collapse becomes deserved. This moral framing removes the need to grapple with the uncomfortable possibility that advanced societies can fail without moral cause. In many traditions, the builders of earlier monuments are described as giants, gods, or semi-divine beings. This serves a dual purpose. It explains the skill gap and removes those builders from the human lineage. If only gods could have built such things, then humans are absolved of comparison. The past is elevated beyond reach, and the present remains central. As writing systems develop, this process accelerates. Writing fixes narratives in place. What is written gains authority. What is unwritten fades. Early scribes were not historians in the modern sense. They were administrators, priests, and servants of power. They recorded what mattered to the functioning of their society. This means that early written history is inherently selective. It preserves kings, laws, rituals, and transactions. It rarely preserves dissent, uncertainty, or alternative interpretations. When older knowledge survives outside of writing, in stone or oral tradition, it is often sidelined as myth. Rewriting also occurs through classification. When later societies encounter artifacts they cannot explain, they categorize them according to familiar frameworks. A tool becomes ceremonial, a map becomes symbolic, an alignment becomes coincidence. These classifications are not malicious. They are pragmatic. They allow the present to remain intelligible. But classification is a form of control. Once something is labelled, it stops asking questions. A stone platform labelled as ritual no longer demands an engineering explanation. A calendar labelled as myth no longer requires astronomical justification. Rewriting occurs by narrowing interpretation until discomfort disappears. Survivors also rewrite history by omission. What they cannot explain is often left unrecorded. Silence becomes default. Over time, that silence is mistaken for absence. The missing layer disappears not because it was disproven, but because it was never preserved. Power plays a role here as well. As societies stabilise, authority becomes centralised. Centralisation requires continuity. It requires lineage, tradition, and legitimacy. Acknowledging that current systems are inherited fragments of something lost undermines that legitimacy. It suggests impermanence. It suggests vulnerability. It is more useful for authority to claim originality, to present laws as divinely inspired rather than rediscovered, to present knowledge as newly revealed rather than partially remembered. This framing strengthens control. It anchors power in the present. Over time, rewritten history becomes institutionalized. It enters education, ritual, architecture, and identity. Questioning it becomes destabilizing. Alternative interpretations are marginalized. The past becomes a closed book. This does not mean that truth disappears entirely. It persists in anomalies, in sites that do not fit, in techniques that appear without explanation, in myths that refuse to align neatly with doctrine. These are tolerated as curiosities, not integrated as evidence. Survivors are not villains in this story. They are adaptive. They build meaning from what they have. They prioritize cohesion over accuracy. Without this adaptation, civilization might not restart at all. But adaptation comes with cost. Each rewrite smooths complexity. Each retelling simplifies. Each generation moves further from the original context. Eventually, the rewritten version feels natural. The idea that something else existed before feels speculative or unnecessary. This process repeats across civilizations. The pattern is visible in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Andes, and beyond. Each society inherits remnants. Each reframes them. Each builds a narrative that centers itself as origin. Modern history is not exempt from this pattern. It simply operates with different tools. Academic frameworks, funding structures, peer consensus, and publication norms all influence which interpretations are acceptable. Evidence that fits established timelines is easier to support. Evidence that challenges them requires disproportionate proof. This does not mean modern scholars are intentionally erasing the past. It means they operate within inherited narratives just as ancient scribes did. Paradigms persist because they are functional, not because they are complete. Rewriting also happens through specialization. Disciplines divide knowledge into manageable domains. Archaeology studies artifacts. Astronomy studies stars. Mythology studies stories. When evidence spans domains, it often falls between them. No single field claims responsibility. The larger pattern goes unnoticed. The idea of a lost prior civilization requires integration. It requires geology, archaeology, astronomy, mythology, and engineering to be considered together. This integration is rare. Fragmentation favours rewriting by default. Survivors rewrite history not by fabricating events, but by selecting which connections to acknowledge. Over time, selection becomes structure. Structure becomes belief. The most powerful rewriting happens when the rewritten version feels obvious, when alternatives feel fringe, when questions feel unnecessary. This is when history appears settled, even if its foundation is incomplete. What remains of earlier civilizations often survives in plain sight. Foundations reused, stones incorporated, alignments preserved. But their meaning is reinterpreted. A platform becomes a temple, a calendar becomes a ritual cycle, a map becomes allegory. This reinterpretation is not random. It reflects the needs and worldview of the inheriting culture. Meaning flows forward, not backward. The past is reshaped to serve the present. Over long spans of time, this results in a layered narrative. Each civilization writes itself onto the ruins of the last. Each believes itself new. Each quietly inherits more than it admits. When collapse happens again, the process repeats. Survivors gather fragments. They tell stories. They explain ruins. They establish legitimacy. They rewrite. This cycle does not require malice. It requires survival. And survival favours coherence over complexity. The danger lies not in rewriting itself, but in forgetting that rewriting occurred. When rewritten history is mistaken for complete history, blind spots emerge. Patterns are missed. Vulnerabilities are ignored. The idea that civilizations rise and fall repeatedly is uncomfortable, because it strips away the illusion of permanence. It suggests that our own story may one day be rewritten by survivors who inherit fragments of our world. They will interpret what remains according to their needs. Our technologies may become rituals. Our data may become myth. Our structures may become sacred. They will not be wrong to do so. They will be doing exactly what survivors have always done. Understanding that winners write history and survivors rewrite it does not mean rejecting all historical accounts. It means reading them with humility. It means recognizing that every narrative is shaped by those who needed it to function. Beneath those narratives, deeper patterns persist. They are not erased completely. They are obscured, layered, and softened by retelling. As attention continues forward, those patterns begin to intersect with something more deliberate. Not just forgetting, but intentional silence. Because once history becomes power, deciding what is remembered and what is dismissed becomes an act of control rather than survival. And that is where the story moves next. There are moments in history when knowledge does not simply fade. It is removed. Sometimes violently, sometimes quietly, sometimes so completely that later generations argue over whether it ever existed at all. Burned libraries, buried cities, and silent resets are not rare anomalies scattered across time. They are recurring features of civilization's relationship with its own memory. Libraries are often described as collections of books, but in ancient societies they were something far more fragile. They were convergence points: astronomy, engineering, law, medicine, agriculture, ritual. When a library burned, it was not just texts that were lost. It was the connective tissue between disciplines. Without that tissue, surviving knowledge fragments could no longer reinforce one another. Understanding collapsed even where facts survived. The most famous example, the Library of Alexandria, has become almost symbolic of this process. Its destruction is debated, fragmented across accounts, and often minimized as exaggerated. But focusing on a single library misses the larger pattern. Alexandria was not unique. Across the ancient world, repositories of accumulated knowledge existed wherever civilization stabilized long enough to value preservation. Temples, palaces, schools, administrative centers. These were targeted during conflict, neglected during decline, or repurposed when priorities shifted. Fire is an efficient eraser. Papyrus, parchment, wood, ink. Entire intellectual traditions can vanish in a single generation. When records disappear, reconstruction becomes speculative. Later cultures fill gaps with assumptions shaped by their own limitations. The absence of evidence becomes mistaken for evidence of absence. But fire is only one method of erasure. Water is quieter. Floods do not announce their intent. They deposit sediment, shift rivers, and slowly bury cities. Structures collapse inward, fill with debris, and disappear beneath layers that later appear geological rather than cultural. When excavation finally occurs, if it occurs at all, deeper layers are often dismissed as natural or too degraded to interpret. Buried cities are not rare. They are common enough that entire fields of archaeology depend on stratigraphy. What is less discussed is how often older layers are bypassed or misattributed because they do not fit expected timelines. Excavation tends to stop when recognized civilization is reached. What lies beneath is often assumed to be simpler, earlier, and less significant. In some cases, cities are buried not by catastrophe but by reuse. Later civilizations build directly atop earlier ones. Foundations become basements, walls become quarries, streets become fill. Over time, the earlier city is absorbed rather than destroyed. Its outline vanishes beneath the living city above it. This process creates continuity at the surface while erasing depth. Silent resets occur when collapse is followed by reoccupation without memory. A region empties. Time passes. New settlers arrive. They find ruins without names. They repurpose stones. They assign meaning. The reset is silent because no one remembers the transition. There is no recorded break, only a before that is no longer accessible. This process explains why some ancient sites show multiple occupations separated by gaps with no clear narrative. Layers of habitation appear, disappear, and reappear. The absence of writing during those gaps creates the illusion of emptiness. In reality, those periods may have been filled with survival, migration, and adaptation rather than stagnation. Burned libraries represent intellectual collapse. Buried cities represent material collapse. Silent resets represent cultural collapse. Together they form a mechanism by which entire civilizations can vanish from history without leaving a coherent trace. The loss is compounded by selectivity. Not all knowledge is preserved equally. Practical techniques may survive longer than theoretical understanding. Ritual may outlast explanation. Symbols may persist while their reference fades. When a civilization rebuilds, it does so unevenly, guided by what remains visible rather than what was most important. Consider mathematics. Abstract mathematical knowledge requires notation, teaching, and continuity. Without writing, it evaporates quickly. Geometry survives longer when embedded in architecture. Ratios can persist when carved into stone, but the reasoning behind them disappears. Later builders copy proportions without understanding why they matter. Astronomy follows a similar pattern. Observational data may survive in alignments and calendars. The interpretive framework behind those observations is more fragile. When collapse interrupts observation, long cycles become incomprehensible. Later cultures inherit markers without context. Medicine collapses even faster. Without texts, techniques degrade into folk practices. Anatomical knowledge disappears. Surgical precision is lost. Remedies become ritualized. This is not because ancient medicine was ineffective, but because its transmission depended on institutions that no longer existed. Law and governance fragment as well. Written codes vanish. Authority becomes local. Power decentralizes. Over generations, centralized systems are forgotten. When writing returns, new codes are framed as original, even if they echo older structures. Burned libraries do not just erase knowledge, they erase precedent. Without precedent, each generation believes it is facing problems for the first time. Solutions are reinvented imperfectly. Mistakes repeat. The emotional impact of this loss is visible in ancient texts that survive. Laments about lost wisdom appear repeatedly. Writers speak of earlier ages with reverence and distance. They do not describe progress. They describe decline from something greater. This sense of decline is often dismissed as nostalgia, but nostalgia usually exaggerates the past without specificity. These texts describe concrete losses, techniques no longer practiced, knowledge no longer accessible, a sense that something foundational has slipped away. Buried cities contribute to this loss by removing physical reference points. When monuments disappear beneath earth or water, they stop reminding later generations of what was once possible. Without visible comparison, assumptions reset downward. Capability shrinks quietly. Silent resets are especially powerful because they erase awareness of erasure. When no one remembers collapse, the new civilization believes itself unprecedented. It attributes sophistication to innovation rather than inheritance. The deeper past becomes irrelevant by default. This is how entire chapters of human history can vanish without conspiracy. No single group needs to decide to erase the past. Time, catastrophe, and practicality do the work. Modern excavation occasionally disrupts this process. A city emerges from sand. A site is discovered beneath jungle. A submerged structure is identified off a coastline. Each discovery feels shocking because it contradicts assumed emptiness. But these discoveries are treated as exceptions rather than signals. The narrative adjusts locally rather than globally. A site is reclassified. A date is revised. The broader timeline remains intact. The reset continues. Burned libraries also shape modern understanding indirectly. Many ancient texts survive only as references in later works. Secondary quotations replace primary sources. Context is filtered through interpretation. Errors propagate. When knowledge is lost repeatedly, civilizations become cautious. They focus on durability. Stone over scroll. Monument over manuscript, but even stone cannot preserve everything. Without explanation, it becomes mute. Silent resets also influence belief systems. When origins are unknown, divine explanations fill the gap. Gods become teachers. Catastrophe becomes punishment. Cycles become destiny. These frameworks stabilize societies emotionally, even as they obscure historical truth. The cumulative effect of burned libraries, buried cities, and silent resets is a historical record that looks younger than it is. The deep past is flattened. Complexity is compressed. Civilization appears to spring up suddenly because its earlier iterations have been erased unevenly. This erasure creates a false sense of novelty. Each civilization believes itself closer to the beginning than it actually is. Each repeats patterns without recognizing them. What survives across resets are not details but structures. Social hierarchies, sacred centers, astronomical concern, monumental architecture. These reappear because they are resilient, not because they are newly invented. The danger of ignoring silent resets is that it encourages overconfidence. If civilization appears to rise only once, collapse feels improbable. If it rises repeatedly, collapse becomes part of the pattern. Burned libraries warn that knowledge is fragile. Buried cities warn that infrastructure is temporary. Silent resets warn that memory itself is unstable. Together they suggest that the past is not fully gone, only inaccessible. Its absence is not proof of simplicity. It is evidence of erasure. As attention continues, the question shifts from how civilizations disappear to why some disappear more completely than others. Why certain layers are almost entirely missing. Why some knowledge seems intentionally neglected rather than accidentally lost. Because beyond fire, water, and time, there is another force that shapes memory. Choice. The decision of what to preserve, what to ignore, and what to let sink quietly beneath the surface. There is a difference between a story meant to entertain and a memory struggling to survive distortion. Stories wander, memories repeat. When myths from distant cultures echo one another, not just in theme but in structure, sequence and consequence, they begin to behave less like imagination and more like compressed recollection. Across continents that had no known contact, ancient myths describe worlds before this one. Not metaphorical worlds, but earlier orders of reality that ended violently. Floods that erased cities, fires from the sky. Ages when knowledge was greater, when beings walked among humans teaching skills that later generations struggled to reproduce. These myths do not read like creative experiments. They read like accounts that have been retold too many times to retain detail, but not enough times to lose their shape. One of the clearest indicators that myths function as memory is their restraint. True fantasy expands freely. It embellishes. It explores novelty. Ancient myths, by contrast, are often repetitive, conservative, and oddly specific in their limitations. They return to the same events, the same warnings, the same losses. They do not imagine endless variations of catastrophe. They remember one. Flood myths are the most obvious example. They appear globally. Mesopotamia, India, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Australia. The details vary, but the framework remains stable. A prior world existed. It became corrupt, unstable, or out of balance. Water rose. Most life was destroyed. A small group survived. Knowledge was carried forward imperfectly. Civilization began again. If these were independent inventions, variation would dominate. Instead, the same emotional tone recurs. Regret, preservation, restart. The survivors are not triumphant heroes. They are burdened caretakers of what remains. This is not the psychology of myth-making for entertainment. It is the psychology of trauma transmission. Fire myths behave similarly. Accounts of burning skies, falling stars, and divine punishment by flame appear repeatedly. These stories often describe intense heat, darkness, and sudden destruction rather than gradual change. They align uncomfortably well with impact events and atmospheric disruption. Again, the emphasis is not spectacle, but aftermath. Another recurring element is the idea of ages, or worlds. Many mythologies divide time into distinct eras separated by catastrophe. The Greek ages of man, the Hindu yugas, the Mesoamerican suns, the Andean world cycles. These are not vague divisions. They are structured sequences. Each age has characteristics. Each ends. Each reset diminishes something from the previous one. This diminishing is important. Myths rarely claim that the present age is superior. They almost always insist it is lesser. Shorter lifespans, weaker bodies, less knowledge. This runs counter to human ego. Cultures inventing myths tend to glorify their present or future. Cultures preserving memory often mourn the past. The presence of culture heroes further reinforces this interpretation. Figures who arrive after catastrophe and teach agriculture, architecture, astronomy, law. They do not invent these things experimentally, they restore them. They are often described as carrying knowledge from before. Their role is transmission, not creation. These figures are frequently semi-divine, not because they were supernatural, but because their knowledge seemed unattainable to later people. When method is lost, expertise becomes magic. When context disappears, technology becomes miracle. The consistency of mythic instruction is revealing. Across cultures, the same domains are emphasized. Farming, measurement, timekeeping, social order. These are foundational systems. They are not decorative. They are the systems required to restart civilization quickly after collapse. Myths remember what mattered most. Myths also preserve warnings, hubris, imbalance, disregard for natural cycles. These themes appear repeatedly. They function less as moral lessons and more as encoded cause and effect relationships. When societies ignore limits, catastrophe follows. This is not abstract morality. It is experiential learning passed forward. Another feature that distinguishes memory from story is geographical anchoring. Many myths reference specific places: mountains where survivors landed, valleys that flooded, cities that vanished. These locations are often real. Over time, the physical context erodes, but the place names remain. This grounding resists pure invention. Language itself preserves memory through metaphor. Words for destruction often overlap with words for cleansing. Words for creation overlap with rebuilding. This linguistic overlap suggests that origin and recovery were not distinct experiences. Civilization did not begin once. It began again. Myths also exhibit compression. Long processes are collapsed into singular events. A centuries-long climate shift becomes a single flood. Multiple impact events become one falling fire. This is how memory behaves when transmitted orally. Duration collapses, sequence survives. The psychological tone of these myths matters. They are not optimistic. They do not promise endless improvement. They warn of repetition. They describe cycles that cannot be escaped, only endured. This worldview makes sense only if repetition has already been experienced. Another indicator of memory is embarrassment. Many myths include elements that reflect poorly on humanity: failure, disobedience, shortcomings. Cultures inventing identity myths tend to elevate themselves. Cultures transmitting memory often accept blame. This humility suggests lived consequence rather than symbolic fiction. Myths also preserve technological incongruities. Descriptions of flying objects, powerful weapons, global communication, or godlike tools appear sporadically. These are often dismissed as metaphor, but metaphor alone does not explain why such imagery clusters around transitional periods, especially the ends of ages. The argument is not that myths are literal transcripts. They are not. Memory distorts. Symbols replace specifics, but structure persists. When the same structures appear globally, memory becomes the simpler explanation. Modern people often underestimate oral transmission. Oral cultures can preserve complex information accurately over long periods when that information is tied to survival. Navigation, seasonal cycles, and genealogy are transmitted reliably for thousands of years. Catastrophe would be transmitted the same way. The reluctance to treat myths as memory stems partly from academic compartmentalization. Mythology is studied separately from geology, archaeology, and astronomy. When connections cross boundaries, they are often ignored. But memory does not respect disciplines. Myths also evolve adaptively. As environments change, details shift. Flood heights adjust, locations move, characters change names, but the core sequence remains. This adaptability is a hallmark of memory, not fiction. Fiction ossifies around authorship. Memory flexes around relevance. The fact that myths often contradict one another on details but agree on outcomes is significant. Agreement on outcome implies shared event. Disagreement on detail implies transmission through different cultural lenses. Another important feature is inevitability. Myths often present catastrophe as unavoidable. This reflects lived experience of helplessness. When people survive events beyond control, inevitability becomes central to narrative. Myths also preserve scale poorly. Numbers inflate, durations stretch. This is expected. What matters is relational scale. Everything before was bigger, everything after is smaller. This gradient reflects loss. In many traditions, writing itself is described as a gift from the past, not an invention of the present. Scripts are attributed to gods or ancient sages. This framing suggests that writing returned after absence, not that it appeared spontaneously. The dismissal of myths as stories is often based on discomfort rather than analysis. If myths are memory, then history is incomplete. If history is incomplete, certainty collapses. It is easier to relegate myths to imagination than to reopen settled timelines. Yet myths continue to behave badly under that dismissal. They refuse to stay isolated. They They intersect with geological evidence. They align with astronomical cycles. They echo each other across oceans. The deeper question is not whether myths are true, but what kind of truth they carry. They carry experiential truth, the truth of having lived through collapse and rebuild, the truth of knowing that civilization is fragile, the truth of having inherited a broken world. If myths are memory, then humanity has already experienced endings. More than once, the present becomes not a first attempt, but a continuation. The stories we tell about gods and floods become warnings, not fantasies. This reframes mythology from superstition to archive, a damaged archive, an incomplete one, but an archive nonetheless. When myths are read this way, they stop sounding childish and start sounding cautious. They do not promise salvation. They do not predict triumph. They remind. As attention moves forward, the focus shifts from memory itself to its consequences. Because when memories of collapse persist long enough to shape belief systems, they begin to influence behaviour, architecture, power, and fear. Myths that behave like memories do not ask to be believed. They ask to be noticed. They persist because something happened that was too large to forget, even when forgetting became necessary to continue. And in that persistence, they quietly undermine the idea that the present world is the first of its kind, suggesting instead that it is one more layer built atop a foundation of remembered endings. When the possibility of a prior advanced civilization is raised, the immediate assumption is often that its disappearance must have been accidental. Climate change, impact events, geological upheaval. These explanations are familiar, comfortable, and impersonal. They frame collapse as tragedy rather than consequence. But there is another dimension that is rarely explored because it unsettles something deeper. The idea that a civilization may not simply have fallen, but that its continuation was incompatible with what came after, that it could not be allowed to remain. This does not require shadowy villains or secret councils operating across millennia. It requires only power, fear, and the fragile nature of memory after collapse. Because once a civilization reaches a certain level of integration, it shapes the future whether it survives or not. And sometimes, survival itself becomes the threat. A highly advanced civilization does not just possess tools, it possesses reference points. It defines what is possible. It establishes standards. For those who come after, such a civilization is not merely impressive, it is destabilizing. It challenges legitimacy. It undermines origin stories. It makes later authority provisional rather than absolute. After a collapse, survivors face a choice, often unconsciously. They can attempt to preserve the old order as faithfully as possible, or they can reinterpret what remains to serve new structures of power. The first path requires continuity, cooperation, and humility. The second path requires selection, simplification, and silence. Over time, the second path wins more often. If remnants of an earlier civilization remain too visible, too comprehensible, they would prevent the next civilization from claiming primacy. Kings could not claim divine mandate if ruins proved others once ruled with greater mastery. Priests could not claim exclusive access to knowledge if evidence showed knowledge was once common. Elites could not define themselves as chosen if history suggested repetition rather than destiny. This is where allowance becomes relevant. A civilization does not need to be actively destroyed to be disallowed. It only needs to be neglected, misinterpreted, and stripped of context until its presence no longer challenges the present. Knowledge that threatens power is rarely preserved intact. It is reframed, restricted, ritualized, buried under layers of interpretation that render it symbolic rather than functional. Consider how early civilizations treat inherited knowledge. Astronomy becomes sacred rather than analytical. Geometry becomes symbolic rather than practical. Engineering becomes mythologized. These shifts are not accidental. They remove accessibility. They place knowledge behind authority. When something is sacred, it cannot be questioned. When it cannot be questioned, it cannot be tested. When it cannot be tested, it cannot threaten existing structures. This is not a conscious conspiracy. It is an adaptive process. Societies that survive are those that stabilize. Stability requires control of narrative. Control of narrative requires limitation of comparison. An earlier civilization that demonstrated advanced planning, global awareness, or deep environmental understanding would introduce dangerous comparisons. Why did they fall? What did they know that we do not? Are we repeating their mistakes? These questions destabilize confidence. Confidence is currency. It keeps populations aligned. It sustains hierarchy. It allows long-term projects to proceed without constant doubt. A civilization haunted by visible predecessors struggles to maintain that confidence. This dynamic explains why earlier civilizations are often framed as primitive, even when evidence contradicts it. Framing the past as inferior is not arrogance. It is insulation. It protects the present from uncomfortable reflection. It also explains why some ruins are preserved while others are dismantled. Structures that can be absorbed into existing belief systems are kept. Structures that resist interpretation are quarried, buried, or ignored. Over time, the landscape is curated to reinforce the accepted narrative. Even catastrophes themselves can be reinterpreted in ways that erase agency. Floods become divine punishment rather than environmental response. Fire becomes moral cleansing rather than physical consequence. This framing absolves later societies from learning too much from the past. It replaces analysis with obedience. The idea that a civilization could not be allowed to remain does not require intent at the moment of collapse. It often emerges afterward. Survivors decide what to remember based on what helps them function. If remnants of advanced technology exist but cannot be maintained, they become liabilities. They demand explanation. They invite dependence. Removing them simplifies recovery. Burning a library may feel like loss, but it also removes a burden of comprehension that cannot be sustained. Throughout history, moments of ideological consolidation coincide with destruction of records. Not because records are evil, but because plurality of memory threatens unity. A single narrative is easier to govern than many. This pattern appears repeatedly. Religious reforms eliminate prior texts. New regimes rewrite chronicles. Languages are simplified. Scripts are replaced. The past becomes smaller and more manageable. On deep timescales, the same process applies to entire civilizations. An advanced civilization that understood long-term cycles, environmental limits, or global interconnection would carry warnings incompatible with unchecked expansion. Its memory would caution restraint. It would suggest boundaries. It would undermine myths of endless growth. For later civilizations built on expansion, such warnings are inconvenient. Removing or neutralizing that memory allows optimism to flourish. It allows belief in uniqueness. It allows the assumption that failure is unlikely because it has never happened before. The erasure of a prior civilization, whether through neglect or reinterpretation, serves a psychological function. It allows the present to feel unprecedented. And unprecedented civilizations feel entitled to take risks. There is also a deeper fear at work. If civilization has collapsed before, it can collapse again. If advanced knowledge once existed and was lost, then advancement is not protection. This realization destabilizes the very idea of progress as salvation. It is easier to believe that collapse only happens to the ignorant or immoral. It is harder to accept that collapse is systemic. Allowing evidence of a prior advanced civilization to remain visible would force that acceptance. It would force humility. Humility is not an organizing principle of empire. This is why some knowledge survives only in coded form, as myth, as ritual, as allegory. These forms preserve memory without granting agency. They warn without empowering. A myth about a flood can shape behavior without requiring people to understand climate systems. A ritual calendar can preserve seasonal alignment without teaching astronomy. A sacred geometry can guide construction without explaining mathematics. These are safe forms of inheritance. They do not challenge authority. They do not invite comparison. They do not demand explanation. The prior civilization, if it existed, may have been environmentally integrated rather than extractive. It may have prioritized balance over growth. Its continued existence would challenge later models built on consumption and expansion. This does not require moral judgment. It reflects structural incompatibility. Systems built on different assumptions cannot coexist easily. One must be reframed or removed. As time passes, removal becomes easier. Context decays. Ruins become scenery. Knowledge becomes legend. The civilization is no longer present enough to threaten legitimacy. Modern civilization participates in this same process, though unconsciously. Evidence that challenges established timelines is labelled fringe. Integration across disciplines is discouraged. Funding favours incremental work over paradigm shifts. These are not acts of suppression, they are acts of stabilisation. The deeper truth is that civilizations are not neutral observers of the past. They curate it. They select which ancestors are acceptable. They elevate some memories and discard others. A prior civilization that reached advanced understanding and still failed is not an acceptable ancestor. It undermines confidence. It suggests limits. It implies repetition. So it is safer for such a civilization to be forgotten, or at least rendered mythic. This does not mean its memory is gone. It persists in distortions, in discomfort, in the sense that something does not quite add up, in the recurring fascination with lost worlds, golden ages and vanished knowledge. These obsessions are not escapism. They are intuition pressing against narrative boundaries. The idea that this civilization could not be allowed to remain does not imply malice. It implies selection. Memory survives where it is useful. It decays where it is disruptive. Over thousands of years, this selection becomes invisible. No one remembers choosing. The choice feels natural. The past feels settled. But unsettled questions remain. Why did knowledge appear so early? Why did it vanish so completely? Why do the same patterns repeat? Why do myths warn rather than celebrate? These questions do not accuse, they observe. If a civilization once existed that understood the fragility of complex systems, its warnings would be unwelcome to later societies driven by growth. Its continued presence would complicate ambition. Its memory would slow expansion. In that sense, it could not be allowed to remain, not because it was dangerous, but because it was inconvenient. Civilizations rarely erase what flatters them. They erase what humbles them. As the story continues, attention turns to what fragments survive despite this erasure. Not the grand systems, but the subtle traces, symbols, structures, ratios, echoes that slipped through because they were misunderstood, overlooked, or too deeply embedded to remove. These fragments did not survive because they were protected. They survived because they were misread. And in that misreading, they waited. Even when a civilization is erased, it is never erased cleanly. Total removal is rare. What survives is not the obvious centre, not the libraries, not the governing systems, but the fragments that were either too mundane to destroy or too deeply embedded to recognise as dangerous. These fragments do not announce themselves as evidence. They persist quietly, misclassified, repurposed, or taken for granted. And because they survive without context, they often escape deliberate removal. Symbols are among the most resilient of these fragments. Unlike texts, symbols do not require literacy. Unlike machines, they do not require maintenance. A symbol can be carried across generations by repetition alone. Over time, its meaning may shift, but its form remains surprisingly stable. This stability allows symbols to act as containers for memory long after their original reference has been forgotten. Across the ancient world, the same symbolic forms recur. spirals, serpents, concentric circles, stepped forms, intersecting grids. These are often dismissed as universal artistic tendencies, the natural outcome of human psychology. But universality does not explain consistency of use. These symbols appear not only as decoration, but embedded in sacred architecture, cosmology, and ritual practice. They appear where meaning matters. The serpent, for example, appears globally as a symbol associated with knowledge, renewal, cycles, and danger. It sheds its skin. It moves between earth and water. It appears at thresholds. This symbolism is not arbitrary. It encodes observation of natural cycles and transformation. When such a symbol appears independently, variation would dominate. Instead, the serpent carries remarkably similar associations across cultures that never met. The same can be said for stepped pyramids, ziggurats, and terraced platforms. These structures appear in different materials at different scales, but with the same conceptual logic. Elevated centres, processional ascent, alignment with sky and horizon. They are not efficient buildings, they are statements. They organise space vertically and symbolically, suggesting a worldview in which elevation and alignment matter deeply. Structures are fragments made durable. When a civilization collapses, its most advanced constructions are often repurposed rather than destroyed. Foundations become sacred precincts. Platforms become temples. Walls become boundaries. Over time, these reused structures lose their original function and gain new meaning. This reuse creates continuity without understanding. Later builders adapt what exists rather than recreate what they cannot. As a result, original design principles survive invisibly beneath later modifications. The deeper layer remains intact even as surface interpretation changes. This is why some ancient sites feel architecturally confused. Different styles coexist awkwardly. Precision stonework supports crude additions. Alignments persist even when no longer referenced consciously. These are not signs of aesthetic inconsistency. They are signs of inheritance. Measurements are another category of fragment that survives unusually well. Units of length, proportion, and ratio can persist long after their origin is forgotten. Builders copy what works. A ratio produces stability. A proportion feels right. Over generations, these measurements become tradition rather than calculation. In some cases, these proportions align closely with natural constants. Ratios reflecting planetary dimensions, solar cycles, or harmonic relationships appear embedded in architecture. Later cultures treat these proportions as sacred or canonical without necessarily knowing why they were chosen originally. When measurement survives without explanation, it becomes ritualized. The act of building becomes an act of repetition rather than innovation. This preserves accuracy while erasing understanding. Echoes also survive in language. Certain phrases, metaphors, and structural patterns appear repeatedly across unrelated languages. Concepts like a world axis, a cosmic mountain, a primordial sea, or a broken age recur. These linguistic echoes are not decorative. They encode shared conceptual frameworks. Language preserves what is used frequently. When certain metaphors persist across millennia, it suggests that they describe something repeatedly experienced or repeatedly remembered. The persistence of collapse-related imagery is not coincidence. It reflects a memory that refuses to disappear entirely. Astronomical knowledge also survives as echo. Star names, constellation stories, and calendar structures persist long after the original observations cease. Later cultures inherit the sky already named and organized. They may reinterpret meanings, but the framework remains. This explains why certain constellations appear globally with similar shapes and associations. The stars did not change. The sky was inherited. The story was retold. Ritual is perhaps the most efficient carrier of fragmented knowledge. Ritual encodes action without explanation. When meaning is lost, action persists. This allows functional elements to survive under symbolic cover. Seasonal festivals, planting rituals, solstice ceremonies, and initiation rites often align with environmental cycles precisely. Participants may not know why the timing matters, only that it does. This preserves synchronization with natural systems long after scientific understanding fades. Ritual also preserves caution. Many rituals encode limits. Do not build here. Do not enter at this time. Do not cross this boundary. These restrictions often trace back to environmental realities or historical trauma. Over time, they become taboo rather than instruction. Fragments also survive in myths already discussed, but here their material dimension becomes clearer. Myths are not isolated stories. They are connected to places, objects, and practices. A story about a flood corresponds to a temple elevation. A story about fire corresponds to a forbidden zone. Narrative anchors behaviour. The most telling fragments are those that later civilizations struggle to explain. Structures described as ceremonial with no clear ritual function. Symbols revered but not understood. Sites preserved despite practical inconvenience. These are often the most ancient layers, tolerated rather than integrated. Tolerance is a survival strategy for fragments. When something cannot be removed easily, it is redefined. Redefinition allows coexistence without confrontation. This process explains why certain ancient sites remain focal points for thousands of years. They are built over repeatedly, not because they are convenient, but because they carry authority. That authority does not come from current understanding. It comes from inherited weight. Fragments survive best when they are misinterpreted in a harmless way. A precise alignment becomes symbolic. A technical structure becomes sacred. A warning becomes myth. In this form, the fragment no longer threatens the present, so it is allowed to remain. Over time, these fragments accumulate. They form a background texture of civilization that feels ancient but inexplicable. They generate a sense of depth without clarity. Modern observers often sense this depth intuitively. Certain sites feel older than their assigned dates. Certain symbols feel heavier than their explanations. This intuition is often dismissed as subjective, but intuition is pattern recognition operating without conscious articulation. Fragments also survive because they are distributed. No single piece carries the whole story. Each fragment is incomplete. Only when viewed collectively do they suggest something larger. This distribution protects them from removal. No one fragment appears significant enough to challenge the timeline alone. When fragments are studied in isolation, they are manageable. When connected, they become unsettling. This is why connection is resisted. Integration transforms fragments into evidence. The survival of these fragments suggests that erasure was incomplete, not because it failed, but because total erasure is impossible. Some things embed too deeply. They sink into behaviour, belief, and environment. The prior civilization, if it existed, did not survive as a recognisable whole. It survived as residue, as shape without explanation, as form without function, as echo without voice. These echoes influence later civilizations unconsciously. They guide building choices. They shape cosmology. They influence what feels important. They do not instruct directly. They bias subtly. This bias is visible in repeated obsessions: alignment, permanence, measurement, cycles. These priorities recur even when not strictly necessary. They feel inherited rather than invented. Fragments also survive in mistakes, in inefficiencies repeated without understanding, in rituals that no longer serve clear purpose. These are not errors. They are fossils of process. Understanding fragments requires patience. They do not point clearly backward. They curve. They overlap. They contradict. They resist simplification. This resistance is why fragments are often dismissed as coincidence. Coincidence is easier than reconstruction. Reconstruction demands humility and uncertainty. But when fragments persist across continents, cultures, and millennia, Coincidence loses explanatory power. Pattern takes its place. The existence of surviving fragments does not prove a single lost civilization beyond doubt. It suggests continuity beneath disruption. It suggests that humanity carries forward more than it remembers. These fragments are not messages waiting to be decoded. They are constraint shaping behaviour. They influence without explaining. They also serve as quiet reminders. Civilization does not start from zero. It starts from debris, from partial memory, from shapes whose original meaning is no longer accessible. As long as fragments remain misunderstood, they remain safe. The danger is not that they exist. The danger is that they might be recognized for what they are. Because once fragments are recognized as survivors, rather than curiosities, they force a re-evaluation of the past. They challenge the idea of clean beginnings. They suggest depth where simplicity was assumed, and that re-evaluation does not stop at history. It extends forward. Because if fragments from a prior civilization survive this long, embedded in stone, symbol and habit, then fragments of the present will survive too. Misunderstood, repurposed, ritualized. They will shape whatever comes next without explanation. And the echoes we leave behind may one day be studied by people who feel the same discomfort, standing among remnants that seem to know more than their stories allow. If we are the seventh civilization, then what defines us is not originality, but inheritance. Not the act of beginning, but the condition of arriving late to a story already told several times before. This idea is unsettling, because modern civilization understands itself primarily as an origin point. We speak of breakthroughs, revolutions, and firsts. We describe ourselves as unprecedented. But inheritance changes the frame. It suggests that much of what we believe we discovered was already known, already tested, and already lost. Inheritance does not arrive neatly labelled. It does not come with manuals or warnings attached. It arrives as partial systems, half-understood tools, habits that feel natural but lack explanation. It arrives as confidence without memory. And that may be the most dangerous form of inheritance of all. If previous civilizations rose, reached complexity and collapsed, then what we inherit is not just knowledge fragments. We inherit behavioral patterns. We inherit blind spots. We inherit assumptions that feel reasonable because they have always been present, even though they may have contributed to collapse before. One of the clearest inheritances is the belief in permanence. Every civilization that reaches a certain level of stability begins to assume continuity. Infrastructure becomes fixed. Institutions become rigid. Long-term planning assumes that the environment will remain within predictable bounds. This assumption feels rational because it has held true for several generations. But generations are short. Planetary systems are not. Earlier civilizations likely made the same assumption. Their monuments suggest confidence. Their cities suggest planning for centuries. Their calendars suggest long-term order. None of that protected them from abrupt change. What we inherit, then, is not their success, but their optimism. Another inheritance is scale. We're obsessed with scale. Larger systems, broader networks, global integration. This is often framed as progress, but scale increases fragility. When systems are tightly coupled, failure propagates faster. Earlier civilizations may have discovered this through collapse rather than theory. If so, their myths of sudden endings are not superstition. They are warnings encoded by experience. We also inherit the habit of abstraction. Modern civilization excels at separating systems from consequences, energy from environment, consumption from depletion, growth from limit. These abstractions allow rapid expansion. They also delay feedback. When feedback finally arrives, it arrives catastrophically rather than gradually. If earlier civilizations reached advanced abstraction without adequate feedback control, their collapse would feel sudden. Survivors would describe it as divine punishment or cosmic imbalance, because the true mechanisms were too complex to articulate without preserved frameworks. This brings us to knowledge itself. We inherit enormous amounts of information, but very little wisdom. Wisdom requires memory of consequence. Information accumulates faster than experience can contextualize it. Earlier civilizations may have faced the same imbalance. Their knowledge survived as fragments, but their understanding of consequence did not. Modern civilization repeats this pattern. We archive data aggressively. We preserve measurements. We record processes, but we struggle to preserve meaning. Digital storage creates the illusion of permanence while remaining incredibly fragile. A single systemic failure can erase more information than centuries of fire ever could. Inheritance also includes mythology, though we no longer call it that. We have narratives of inevitability, progress narratives, technological salvation narratives, economic growth narratives. These function exactly like ancient myths. They explain the world, they justify behavior, they reduce anxiety, and like ancient myths, they resist contradiction. If we are the seventh civilization, then our myths are not less powerful than those of earlier ages. They are simply framed as rational, but framing does not change function. When belief systems discourage examination of limits, they become dangerous regardless of their vocabulary. We also inherit architecture in a broader sense, not stone monuments, but systems of organization, bureaucracy, markets, legal frameworks. These systems are treated as innovations, but many reflect ancient structures adapted to modern scale. Centralization of power, stratification of roles, delegation of responsibility upward and downward. These patterns repeat because they work, until they do not. Earlier civilizations may have reached similar organizational complexity without the ability to adapt quickly when conditions changed. Their rigidity would become liability. Collapse would follow not because they were ignorant, but because they were optimized for stability rather than resilience. Resilience is another inheritance we misunderstand. We often equate resilience with redundancy and strength. But resilience also requires adaptability and humility. It requires the ability to downscale gracefully, to abandon systems when they become harmful. Earlier civilizations may have struggled with this. Their monuments suggest attachment. Their myths suggest regret. We inherit their attachment without their regret. Or rather, we suppress regret by framing collapse as unthinkable. Another inherited trait is reverence for legacy. We build for posterity. We leave marks. We assume someone will come after us to interpret them. Earlier civilizations did the same. Their legacy is what we're now struggling to understand. This should give us pause. Legacy does not guarantee comprehension. It guarantees misinterpretation. If fragments of prior civilizations survived without context, then fragments of ours will as well. Skyscrapers will become mountains, satellites will become stars, data centers will become ruins without meaning. The sophistication we assume will be obvious may be invisible. Inheritance also includes fear, not conscious fear, but embedded caution. Certain anxieties recur across civilizations: fear of floods, fear of fire, fear of sky events, fear of imbalance. Modern civilization translates these fears into climate models, disaster preparedness, and speculative fiction. Earlier civilizations encoded them into myth and ritual. Different language, same anxiety. The persistence of these fears suggests memory deeper than culture. It suggests that humanity remembers catastrophe even when it cannot explain it. If we are the seventh civilization, then we are not special in our intelligence. We are special in our forgetting. We have forgotten that collapse is normal. We have forgotten that complexity amplifies risk. We have forgotten that knowledge without context accelerates failure. What we inherit most strongly is confidence. Confidence that this time is different, that our tools are better, that our models are accurate, that our safeguards are sufficient. Earlier civilizations likely felt the same way near their peaks. Confidence grows fastest when systems appear stable. This is not an argument for despair, it is an argument for awareness. Inheritance does not doom repetition, it only increases its probability if left unexamined. We also inherit responsibility. If we recognize patterns that earlier civilizations could not articulate, then we carry an obligation they did not have. We understand feedback loops, we measure planetary limits, we model collapse scenarios. Ignoring this knowledge would not be innocence, it would be negligence. Earlier civilizations may have lacked the tools to see the full consequences of their actions. We do not. That difference matters, but inheritance complicates responsibility. We are not starting from a neutral position. Our systems are already built, our habits already entrenched. Changing course requires confronting not just external limits, but internal narratives. If we are the seventh civilization, then the most important inheritance is not technology or knowledge. It is choice. The choice to recognize repetition. The choice to value resilience over dominance. The choice to preserve understanding rather than information alone. Preservation must also be reimagined. Stone endured, but it did not communicate. Digital archives communicate, but they may not endure. Preserving knowledge across collapse requires embedding it in multiple layers: physical, cultural, behavioral, symbolic. No single medium survives alone. Earlier civilizations preserved what they could: symbols, rituals, alignments. They didn't fail entirely. We still hear them, but they could not prevent misinterpretation. That may be unavoidable. What we can do differently is acknowledge inheritance explicitly, to teach history as cyclical rather than linear, to normalize collapse as risk rather than anomaly, to design systems that can shrink as well as grow. If we refuse this acknowledgement, then we become what we already suspect. Another layer, another attempt, another civilization that mistook inheritance for originality and confidence for immunity. The question is not whether we will leave fragments behind. We will. The question is what kind of fragments they will be. Warnings or decorations, instructions or myths, foundations or rubble. If we are the seventh civilization, then we stand at a familiar point in the pattern. Advanced, confident, forgetful, surrounded by echoes we half recognize. What distinguishes this moment is not technology, but awareness. Awareness that others stood here before. Awareness that their confidence did not save them. Awareness that inheritance is not a gift, but a test. And how we respond to that test determines whether the number stops here, or whether someone else, much later, will stand among the fragments of our world, trying to decide what we once knew, what we chose to forget, and why the cycle continued one more time. There is a particular stillness that settles in when the larger arguments fall away and only the shape of the idea remains. Not the evidence, not the debate, but the weight of what it implies. When the thought arises that our past may be incomplete, not just missing details, but missing entire chapters, the mind instinctively tries to fill the silence. And it cannot. That silence resists completion. It asks to be sat with, not resolved. What else might be missing from our past is not a question that points toward a single discovery waiting to be unearthed. It points instead toward absence itself as a feature, toward the possibility that loss is not incidental but structural, that history, like geology, is shaped as much by erosion as by accumulation. Civilizations do not leave behind neutral records. They leave behind what survives catastrophe, neglect, reinterpretation, and convenience. What remains is not representative. It is filtered. This means that our picture of the past is not a portrait but a silhouette, and silhouettes hide more than they reveal. Entire categories of human experience may be gone, ways of organizing society that did not rely on hierarchy as we understand it, systems of knowledge transmission that were not text-based, relationships with environment that left minimal physical trace, technologies that prioritize longevity over output, balance over expansion. These would be precisely the kinds of systems least likely to survive violent interruption. We tend to assume that complexity always leaves obvious debris, that advanced societies must announce themselves through machinery, metals, or monuments. But complexity can be quiet. It can be embedded in behaviour rather than infrastructure, in timing rather than tools, in restraint rather than dominance. If earlier civilizations understood limits more deeply than we do, they may have built less conspicuously. Their cities may have blended into landscapes rather than reshaped them aggressively. Their technologies may have relied on organic materials that decay completely. Their most important knowledge may have been ecological rather than mechanical. All of this would leave little behind for archaeology to recover. What might be missing, then, is not just evidence of power, but evidence of wisdom. Modern frameworks are excellent at identifying dominance. We recognise quarrying, large-scale extraction, and monumental construction easily. We struggle to recognise optimization that leaves minimal trace. A society that learned how not to overbuild would appear primitive to later observers who equate impact with advancement. There is also the possibility that certain failures are underrepresented. We tend to find civilizations that succeeded long enough to leave ruins. We do not find those that collapsed quickly, quietly, or adaptively. A civilization that chose to disperse rather than rebuild would leave little concentrated evidence. Its disappearance would look like absence rather than collapse. This reframes the idea of success. Perhaps the civilizations we remember are not the most advanced, but the most rigid, the ones that committed to permanence so completely that they left scars when they fell. Another missing element may be continuity of understanding. We possess fragments of ancient knowledge, but rarely the chain that connects them coherently. Mathematics survives without philosophy. Architecture survives without engineering rationale. Astronomy survives without observational history. This fragmentation creates the illusion of isolated genius rather than inherited systems. The missing past may not be missing achievements. It may be missing explanations. We also underestimate how thoroughly time reorganizes meaning. When context disappears, even intact structures become mute. A dam becomes a wall, a marker becomes decoration, a warning becomes myth. Over centuries, misinterpretation accumulates until the original intent becomes inaccessible. What else might be missing then is not physical at all. It may be perspective. The way earlier civilizations understood their place in time, not as the centre of history, but as one moment within a longer rhythm. This perspective appears faintly in myths of cycles and ages, but it is not preserved explicitly. Later civilizations replaced it with linear narratives that emphasize novelty and progress. If that cyclical understanding was once widespread, its loss would profoundly alter behavior. A civilization that believes itself temporary behaves differently from one that believes itself final. Modern civilization is deeply invested in the idea of culmination. We speak of endgames, final theories, ultimate technologies. This mindset is fragile. It assumes closure where history has repeatedly demonstrated continuation. The missing past may include cautionary models that did not survive because they were incompatible with expansion. Models that emphasize sufficiency rather than growth, stability rather than acceleration. These models would not leave dramatic monuments. They would leave balance. Balance does not fossilize easily. There may also be missing voices. Entire populations erased without record, groups that did not control writing or monument building, survivors whose stories were absorbed into dominant narratives and lost their distinct identity. The past we know is often the past of elites. The past of common life is harder to reconstruct and easier to erase. This applies even more strongly the deeper one goes. Earlier civilizations may have organized knowledge horizontally rather than vertically. If authority was distributed, no central archive would exist to preserve memory through collapse. Knowledge would fragment immediately. Survival would prioritize adaptability over preservation. The irony is that such a civilization might be more resilient in life and more invisible in death. Another missing element is emotional reality. we reconstruct ancient lives through tools and structures, but not through fear, grief, or hesitation. Myths hint at trauma, but archaeology rarely captures it. The emotional cost of collapse, the decisions made under pressure, the compromises accepted, these are rarely visible, yet they shape outcomes as much as technology. We may also be missing failures of restraint, moments when civilizations recognized danger and chose to slow down. These decisions would not produce monuments, they would produce absence. Later observers would see nothing and assume nothing happened. What if some civilizations did not collapse catastrophically, but dissolved intentionally? What if they learned something that made continuation undesirable under existing conditions? Such choices would leave almost no trace, especially if they involve dispersal rather than concentration. The past we reconstruct is biased towards spectacle. Quiet endings do not survive. Another missing component may be the true timescale of human development. We assume linear biological and cultural progression, but if advanced behaviour arose earlier than expected and was interrupted repeatedly, then our models of development are skewed. Intelligence may be more stable than civilization. Capability may persist even when expression does not. This challenges assumptions about modern uniqueness. It suggests that the human mind has been capable of complex organisation for far longer than our surviving record implies. What changed repeatedly was not cognition, but environment and continuity. We may also be missing failed futures, directions civilization could have taken but did not, paths explored briefly and abandoned, technologies that proved unsustainable, social models that did not scale. These would leave minimal trace because they were short-lived and intentionally discontinued. The story of progress often assumes that what survives is what works best. History suggests otherwise. What survives is often what is hardest to dismantle, not what is most adaptive. The missing past may therefore include better ideas than the ones we inherited. There is also the issue of scale mismatch. Archaeology excels at identifying large static structures. It struggles with dynamic systems, trade networks that left little material trace, knowledge exchanges that occurred through migration rather than construction. These systems could be highly sophisticated without leaving clear archaeological signatures. A civilization built around movement rather than settlement would be nearly invisible after collapse. Even more elusive are cognitive frameworks, ways of thinking that shape behaviour without leaving physical artefacts, attitudes toward time, risk, and interdependence. These frameworks influence outcomes profoundly, yet they rarely fossilise. The persistence of certain anxieties suggests that something is remembered even if not articulated. Fear of environmental imbalance, fear of sudden change, fear of losing knowledge. These fears appear ancient. They may originate from experiences no longer accessible. The quiet thought before sleep is not alarm. It is recognition. Recognition that the past may be deeper, quieter, and more complex than the story we tell ourselves. That certainty about beginnings may be misplaced. That confidence about novelty may be inherited rather than earned. If much of our past is missing, then humility becomes a rational stance. Not skepticism, not belief, but openness to incompleteness. This incompleteness does not diminish humanity. It contextualizes it. It suggests continuity rather than exception. It places us within a pattern rather than above it. The idea that we are the seventh civilization does not demand fixation on the number. It invites attention to repetition, to rhythm, to the way complex systems rise, stabilize, strain, and either adapt or fail. What else might be missing from our past may never be fully recovered. Some losses are permanent, but awareness of loss changes behaviour. It shifts focus from domination to stewardship, from certainty to resilience. The past, incomplete as it is, still shapes the present, through fragments, through echoes, through instincts we rarely question. As thought slows, what remains is not urgency, but presence. the recognition that history is not finished speaking, even when its voice is faint. That absence itself carries information. That silence can be instructive. There is no need to resolve this thought. It does not require conclusion. It can rest, unfinished, the way deep ideas often do. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a background awareness that gently alters perspective. Civilization does not begin and end cleanly. It overlaps, it inherits, it forgets, it remembers imperfectly. And in that imperfection, it leaves traces for those who come later. Perhaps that is enough. To notice the traces, to accept that something larger may have preceded us, to move forward with a little less certainty and a little more care. The past may be missing more than we can ever recover, but what remains is sufficient to remind us that nothing stands alone, that every beginning has a history behind it, and that the quietest truths often reveal themselves only when the noise finally fades and the mind is allowed to rest alongside them.